Edgar Allan Poe, The Complete Short Story Collection by Edgar Allan Poe. Narrated by Manny Mac Vella. Edgar Allan Poe, An Appreciation. Born in poverty at Boston, January 19, 1809, dying under painful circumstances at Baltimore, October 7, 1849, his whole literary career, of scarcely 15 years, a pitiful struggle for mere substance, his memory malignantly misrepresented by his earliest biographer, Griswold, how completely has truth at last routed falsehood, and how magnificently has Poe come into his own. For The Raven, first published in 1845, and within a few months read, recited, and parodied whenever the English language was spoken, the half-starved poet received $10. Less than a year later, his brother poet, N.P. Willis, issued this touching appeal to the admirers of genius on behalf of the neglected author, his dying wife and her devoted mother, then living under very straitened circumstances in a little college at Fordham, New York. Quote, "Here is one of the finest scholars, one of the most original men of genius, and one of the most industrious of the literary profession of our country, whose temporary suspension of labor from bodily illness drops him immediately to a level with the common objects of public charity. There is no immediate stopping place, no respectful shelter, where, with the delicacy due to genius and culture, he might secure aid till with returning health he would resume his labors, and his unmortified sense of independence." End quote. And this was the tribute paid by the American public to the master who had given to it such tales of conjuring charm, of witchery and mystery as The Fall of the House of Usher and Ligeia, such fascinating hoaxes as The Unparalleled Adventure of Hans Pfaall, Manuscript Found in a Bottle, A Descent in a Maelstrom, and The Balloon Hoax. Such tales of conscience as William Wilson, The Black Cat, and The Tell-Tale Heart, wherein the retributions of remorse are portrayed with an awful fidelity. Such tales of natural beauty as The Island of the Fae and The Dominion of Arnheim. Such marvelous studies in ratiocination as The Gold Bug, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Purloined Letter, and The Mystery of Marie Roget. The latter a recital of fact, demonstrating the author's wonderful capability of correctly analyzing the mysteries of the human mind. Such tales of illusion and banter as The Premature Burial and The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather. Such bits of extravaganza as The Devil in the Belfry and The Angel of the Odd. Such tales of adventure as The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. Such papers of keen criticism and review as won for Poe the enthusiastic admiration of Charles Dickens, although they made many enemies among the overpuffed minor American writers so mercilessly exposed by him. Such poems of beauty and melody as The Bells, The Haunted Palace, Tamerlane, The City in the Sea, and The Raven. What delight for the jaded senses of the reader is this enchanted domain of wonder pieces! What an atmosphere of beauty, music, color! What resources of imagination, construction, analysis, and absolute art! One might almost sympathize with Sarah Helen Whitman, who, confessing to a half-faith in the old superstition of the significance of anagrams, found in the transposed letters of Edgar Poe's name the words "a god peer." His mind, she says, was indeed a haunted palace, echoing to the footfalls of angels and demons. "No man," Poe himself wrote, "has recorded, no man has dared to record, the wonders of his inner life." In these 20th century days of lavish recognition, artistic, popular, and material, of genius, what rewards might not a Poe claim? Edgar's father, a son of General David Poe, the American Revolutionary patriot and friend of Lafayette, had married Mrs. Hopkins, an English actress, and the match meeting with parental disapproval, had himself taken to the stage as a profession. Notwithstanding Mrs. Poe's beauty and talent, the young couple had a sorry struggle for existence. When Edgar, at the age of 2 years, was orphaned, the family was in the utmost destitution. Apparently, the future poet was to be cast upon the world homeless and friendless. But fate decreed that a few glimmers of sunshine were to illumine his life, for the little fellow was adopted by John Allan, a wealthy merchant of Richmond, Virginia. A brother and sister, The remaining children were cared for by others. In his new home, Edgar found all the luxury and advantages money could provide. He was petted, spoiled, and shown off to strangers. In Mrs. Allan, he found all the affection a childless wife could bestow. Mr. Allan took much pride in the captivating, precocious lad. At the age of 5, the boy recited, with fine effect, passages of English poetry to the visitors at the Allan house. From his 8th to his 13th year, he attended the Manor House School at Stoke Newington, a suburb of London. It was the Reverend Dr. Barnsby, head of the school, whom Poe so quaintly portrayed in William Wilson. Returning to Richmond in 1820, Edgar was sent to the school of Professor Joseph H. Clark. He proved an apt pupil. Years afterward, Professor Clark thus wrote, quote, "While the other boys wrote mere mechanical verses, Poe wrote genuine poetry. The boy was a born poet. As a scholar, he was ambitious to excel. He was remarkable for self-respect, without haughtiness. He had a sensitive and tender heart, and would do anything for a friend. His nature was entirely free from selfishness." End quote. At the age of 17, Poe entered the University of Virginia at Charlottesville. He left that institution after one session. Official records prove that he was not expelled. On the contrary, he gained a credible record as a student, although it is admitted that he contracted debt and had, quote, "an ungovernable passion for card-playing," end quote. These debts may have led to his quarrel with Mr. Allan, which eventually compelled him to make his own way in the world. Early in 1827, Poe made his first literary venture. He induced Calvin Thomas, a poor and youthful printer, to publish a small volume of his verses under the title Tamerlane and Other Poems. In 1829, we find Poe in Baltimore with another manuscript volume of verses, which was soon published. Its title was Al-Araf, Tamerlane and Other Poems. Neither of these ventures seem to have attracted much attention. Soon after Mrs. Allan's death, which occurred in 1829, Poe, through the aid of Mr. Allan, secured admission to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Any glamour which may have attached to cadet life in Poe's eyes was speedily lost, for discipline at West Point was never so severe, nor were the accommodations ever so poor. Poe's bent was more and more toward literature. Life at the academy daily became increasingly distasteful. Soon he began to purposely neglect his studies and to disregard his duties, his aim being to secure his dismissal from the United States service. In this he succeeded. On March 7, 1831, Poe found himself free. Mr. Allan's second marriage had thrown the lad on his own resources. His literary career was to begin. Poe's first genuine victory was won in 1833, when he was the successful competitor for a prize of $100 offered by a Baltimore periodical for the best prose story. A manuscript, found in a bottle, was the winning tale. Poe had submitted 6 stories in a volume. "Our only difficulty," says Mr. Latrobe, one of the judges, "was in selecting from the rich contents of the volume." During the 15 years of his literary life, Poe was connected with various newspapers and magazines in Richmond, Philadelphia, and New York. He was faithful, punctual, industrious, thorough. N.P. Willis, who for some time employed Poe as critic and sub-editor on the Evening Mirror, wrote thus, quote, "With the highest admiration for Poe's genius and a willingness to let it alone for more than ordinary irregularity, we were led by common report to expect a very capricious attention to his duties and occasionally a scene of violence and difficulty. Time went on, however, and he was invariably punctual and industrious. We saw but one presentiment of the man, a quiet, patient, industrious, and most gentlemanly person. We heard from one who knew him well, what should be stated in all mention of his lamentable irregularities, that with a single glass of wine his whole nature was reversed. The demon became uppermost, and though none of the usual signs of intoxication were visible, his will was palpably insane. In this reversed character, we repeat, it was never our chance to meet him." End quote. On September 22, 1835, Poe married his cousin, Virginia Clem, in Baltimore. She had barely turned 13 years. Poe himself was but 26. He then was a resident of Richmond, and a regular contributor to the Southern Literary Messenger. It was not until a year later that the bride and her widowed mother followed him thither. Poe's devotion to his child wife was one of the most beautiful features of his life. Many of his famous poetic productions were inspired by her beauty and charm. Consumption had marked her for its victim, and the constant efforts of husband and mother were to secure for her all the comfort and happiness their slender means permitted. Virginia died January 30th, 1847, when but 25 years of age. A friend of the family pictures the deathbed scene. Mother and husband trying to impart warmth to her by chafing her hands and feet, while her pet cat was suffered to nestle upon her bosom for the sake of added warmth. These verses from Annabel Lee, written by Poe in 1849, the last year of his life, tell of his sorrow at the loss of his child wife. I was a child, and she was a child, in the kingdom by the sea, but we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee. With a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And this was the reason that long ago, in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kingsmen came and bore her away from me, to shut her up in a sepulchre, in this kingdom by the sea. Poe was connected at various times and in various capacities with a Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond, Virginia, Graham's Magazine and the Gentleman's Magazine in Philadelphia, the Evening Mirror, the Broadway Journal, and Godey's Lady's Book in New York. Everywhere, Poe's life was one of unremitting toil. No tales and poems were ever produced at a greater cost of brain and spirit. Poe's initial salary with the Southern Literary Messenger, to which he contributed the first drafts of a number of his best-known tales, was $10 a week. 2 years later, his salary was but $600 a year. Even in 1844, when his literary reputation was established securely, he wrote to a friend expressing his pleasure because a magazine to which he was to contribute had agreed to pay him $20 monthly for 2 pages of criticism. Those were discouraging times in American literature, but Poe never lost faith. He was finally to triumph wherever preeminent talents win admirers. His genius has no better description than in this stanza from William Winter's poem, read at the dedication exercises of the Actors' Monument to Poe, May 4th, 1885, in New York. He was the voice of beauty and of woe, passion and mystery and the dread unknown, pure as the mountains of perpetual snow, cold as the icy winds that round them moan. Dark as the caves wherein earth's thunders groan, wild as the tempests of the upper sky, sweet as the faint far-off celestial tone of angel whispers, fluttering from on high, and tender as love's tear when youth and beauty die. In the 2.50 years that have elapsed since Poe's death, he has come fully into his own. For a while, Griswold's malignant misrepresentations colored the public estimate of Poe as man and as writer. But thanks to J.H. Ingram, W.F. Gill, Eugene Didier, Sarah and Helen Whitman, and others, these scandals have been dispelled, and Poe is seen as he actually was. Not as a man without failings, it is true, but as the finest and most original genius in American letters. As the years go on, his fame increases. His works have been translated into many foreign languages. His is a household name in France and England. In fact, the latter nation has often uttered the reproach that Poe's own country has been slow to appreciate him. But that reproach, if it ever was warranted, certainly is untrue. Metzengerstein. Horror and fatality have been stalking abroad in all ages. Why then give a date to this story I have to tell? Let it suffice to say that at the period of which I speak, there existed in the interior of Hungary a settled, although hidden, belief in the doctrines of the metempsychosis. As the doctrines themselves, that is, of their falsity or of their probability, I say nothing. I assert, however, that much of our incredulity, as La Boyère says of all of our unhappiness, vient de ne pouvoir être seul. But there are some points in the Hungarian superstition which were fast verging to absurdity. They, the Hungarians, differed very essentially from their Eastern authorities. For example, the soul, said the former, I give the words of an acute and intelligent Parisian, ni dimir consol fondan un corps sensible arreste, un cheval, un chien, un homme même, n'est que la resemblance peu tangible de ces animaux. The families of Berlifitzing and Metzengerstein had been at variance for centuries. Never before were two houses so illustrious mutually embittered by hostilities so deadly. The origin of this enmity seems to be found in the words of an ancient prophecy. A lofty name shall have a fearful fall when, as the rider over his horse, the mortality of Metzengerstein shall triumph over the immortality of Berlifitzing. To be sure, the words themselves had little or no meaning, but more trivial causes have given rise, and that no long while ago, to consequences equally eventful. Besides, the estates which were contiguous had long exercised a rival influence in the affairs of a busy government. Moreover, near neighbors are seldom friends, and the inhabitants of the castle Berlifitzing might look, from their lofty buttresses, into the very windows of the palace Metzengerstein. Least of all had the more than feudal magnificence thus discovered a tendency to allay the irritable feelings of the less ancient and less wealthy Berlifitzings. What wonder, then, that the words, however silly if that prediction, should have succeeded in setting and keeping at variance two families already predisposed to quarrel by every instigation of hereditary jealousy. The prophecy seemed to imply, if it implied anything, a final triumph on the part of the already more powerful house, and was of course remembered with the more bittered animosity by the weaker and less influential. Wilhelm Count Berlifitzing, although loftily descended, was, at the epoch of this narrative, an infirm and doting old man, remarkable for nothing but an inordinate and inveterate personal antipathy to the family of his rival, and so passionate a love of horses and of hunting, that neither bodily infirmity, great age, nor mental incapacity prevented his daily participation in the dangers of the chase. Friedrich, Baron Metzengerstein, was on the other hand not yet of age. His father, the minister, died young. His mother, the Lady Mary, followed him quickly after. Frederick was at the time in his 15th year. In a city, 15 years are no long period. A child may still be a child in his third lustrum, but in a wilderness, in so magnificent a wilderness as that old principality, 15 years have a far deeper meaning. For some peculiar circumstances attending the administration of his father, the young baron, at the decease of the former, entered immediately upon his vast possessions. Such estates were seldom held before by a nobleman of Hungary. His castles were without number. The chief in point of splendor and extent was the Chateau Metzengerstein. The boundary line of his dominions were never clearly defined, but his principal park embraced a circuit of 50 miles. Upon the succession of a proprietor so young, with a character so well known, to a fortune so unparalleled, little speculation was afloat in regard to his probable course of conduct. And indeed for the space of 3 days the behavior of the heir out-Heroded Herod, and fairly surpassed the expectations of his most enthusiastic admirers. Shameful debaucheries, flagrant treacheries, unheard-of atrocities, gave his trembling vassals quickly to understand that no servile submission on their part, no punctilios of conscience on his own, were thenceforward to prove any security against the remorseless fangs of a petty Caligula. On the night of the 4th day, the stables of the castle Berlifitzing were discovered to be on fire, and the unanimous opinion of the neighborhood added the crime of the incendiary to the already hideous list of the baron's misdemeanors and enormities. But during the tumult occasioned by this occurrence, the young nobleman himself sat apparently buried in meditation in a vast and desolate upper apartment of the family palace of Metzengerstein. The rich, although faded tapestry hangings, which swung gloomily upon the walls, represented the shadowy and majestic forms of 1,000 illustrious ancestors. Here, rich ermined priests and pontifical dignitaries familiarly seated with the autocrat and the sovereign, put a veto on the wishes of a temporal king, or restrained with the fiat of papal supremacy the rebellious scepter of the arch-enemy. There, the dark tall statures of the Princess Metzengerstein, their muscular war horses plunging over the carcasses of fallen foes, startled the steadiest nerves with their vigorous expression. And here again, the voluptuous and swan-like figures of the dames of days gone by floated away in the mazes of an unreal dance to the strains of imaginary melody. But as the Baron listened, or affected to listen, to the gradually increasing uproar in the stables of Berlifitzing, or perhaps pondered upon some more novel, some more decided act of audacity, his eyes became unwittingly riveted to the figure of an enormous and unnaturally colored horse, represented in the tapestry as belonging to a Saracen ancestor of the family of his rival. The horse itself, in the foreground of the design, stood motionless and statue-like, while farther back its discomforted rider perished by the dagger of a Metzengerstein. On Frederick's lip arose a fiendish expression as he became aware of the direction which his glance had, without his consciousness, assumed. Yet he did not remove it. On the contrary, he could by no means account for the overwhelming anxiety which appeared falling like a pall upon his senses. It was with difficulty that he reconciled his dreamy and incoherent feelings with the certainty of being awake. The longer he gazed, the more absorbing became the spell. The more impossible did it appear that he could ever withdraw his glance from the fascination of the tapestry. But the tumult, without becoming suddenly more violent with a compulsory exertion, he diverted his attention to the glare of ruddy light thrown full by the flaming stables upon the windows of the apartment. The action, however, was but momentary. His gaze returned mechanically to the wall. To his extreme horror and astonishment, the head of the gigantic steed had, in the meantime, altered its position. The neck of the animal, before arched as if in compassion over the prostrate body of its lord, was now extended at full length in the direction of the Baron. The eyes, before invisible, now wore an energetic and human expression, while they gleamed with a fiery and unusual red. And the distended lips of the apparently enraged horse left in full view his gigantic and disgusting teeth. Stupefied with terror, the young nobleman tottered to the door. As he threw it open, a flash of red light streaming far into the chamber flung his shadow with a clear outline against the quivering tapestry, and he shuddered to perceive that shadow, as he staggered a while upon the threshold, assuming the exact position and precisely filling up the contour of the relentless and triumphant murderer of the Saracen Berlifitzing. To lighten the depression of his spirits, the Baron hurried into the open air. At the principal gate of the palace he encountered 3 equerries. With much difficulty, and at the imminent peril of their lives, they were restraining the convulsive plunges of a gigantic and fiery-colored horse. "Whose horse? Where did you get him?" demanded the youth in a querulous and husky tone of voice, as he became instantly aware that the mysterious steed in the tapestried chamber was the very counterpart of the furious animal before his eyes. "He is your own property, sire," replied one of the equerries. "At least he is claimed by no other owner. We caught him flying, all smoking and foaming with rage, from the burning stables of the castle Berlifitzing. Supposing him to have belonged to the old count's stud of foreign horses, we led him back as an estray. But the grooms there disclaim any title to the creature, which is strange, since he bears evident markings of having made a narrow escape from the flames." "The letters WVB are also branded very distinctly on his forehead," interrupted a second equerry. "I supposed them, of course, to be the initials of Wilhelm von Berlifitzing, but all at the castle are positive in denying any knowledge of the horse." "Extremely singular," said the young Baron with a musing air and apparently unconscious of the meaning of his words. "He is, as you say, a remarkable horse, a prodigious horse, although, as you very justly observe, of a suspicious and untractable character. Let him be mine, however," he added after a pause. "Perhaps a rider like Friedrich of Metzengerstein may tame even the devil from the stables of Berlifitzing." "You are mistaken, my lord. The horse, as I think we mentioned, is not from the stables of the Count. If such had been the case, we know our duty better than to bring him into the presence of a noble of your family." "True," observed the Baron dryly. And at that instant a page of the bedchamber came from the palace with a heightened color and a precipitate step. He whispered into his master's ear an account of the sudden disappearance of a small portion of the tapestry, in an apartment which he designated, entering at the same time into particulars of a minute and circumstantial character. But from the low tone of voice in which these latter were communicated, nothing escaped to gratify the excited curiosity of the equerries. The young Frederick during the conference seemed agitated by a variety of emotions. He soon, however, recovered his composure. and an expression of determined malignancy settled upon his countenance as he gave peremptory orders that a certain chamber should be immediately locked up, and the key placed in his own possession. "Have you heard of the unhappy death of the old hunter Berlifitzing?" said one of the vassals to the baron, as after the departure of the page, the huge steed which that nobleman had adopted as his own plunged and curvetted, with redoubled fury, down the long avenue which extended from the chateau to the stables of Metzengerstein. "No," said the baron, turning abruptly toward the speaker. "Dead, say you?" "It is indeed true, my lord, and, to a noble of your name, will be, I imagine, no unwelcome intelligence." A rapid smile shot over the countenance of the listener. "How died he?" "In his rash exertions to rescue a favorite portion of his hunting stud, he has himself perished miserably in the flames." "Indeed!" ejaculated the baron, as if slowly and deliberately impressed with the truth of some exciting idea. "Indeed," repeated the vassal. "Shocking!" said the youth calmly, and turned quietly into the chateau. From this date a marked alteration took place in the outward demeanor of the dissolute young Baron Friedrich von Metzengerstein. Indeed, his behavior disappointed every expectation, and proved little in accordance with the views of many a maneuvering mamma, while his habits and manner, still less than formerly, offered anything congenial with those of the neighboring aristocracy. He was never to be seen beyond the limits of his own domain, and, in this wide and social world, was utterly companionless. Unless, indeed, that unnatural, impetuous, and fiery-colored horse, which he henceforward continually bestrode, had any mysterious right to the title of his friend. Numerous invitations on the part of the neighborhood for a long time, however, periodically came in. "Will the baron honor our festivals with his presence? Will the baron join us in a hunting of the boar?" "Metzengerstein does not hunt. Metzengerstein will not attend," were the haughty and laconic answers. These repeated insults were not to be endured by imperious nobility. Such invitations became less cordial, less frequent. In time, they ceased altogether. The widow of the unfortunate Count Berlifitzing was even heard to express a hope that the baron might be at home when he did not wish to be at home, since he disdained the company of his equals, and ride when he did not wish to ride, since he preferred the society of a horse. This, to be sure, was a very silly explosion of hereditary pique, and merely proved how singularly unmeaning our sayings are apt to become when we desire to be unusually energetic. The charitable, nevertheless, attributed the alteration in the conduct of the young nobleman to the natural sorrow of a son for the untimely loss of his parents, forgetting, however, his atrocious and reckless behavior during the short period immediately succeeding that bereavement. Some there were, indeed, who suggested a too haughty idea of self-consequence and dignity. Others again, among them may be mentioned the family physician, did not hesitate in speaking of morbid melancholy and hereditary ill health, while dark hints of a more equivocal nature were current among the multitude. Indeed, the baron's perverse attachment to his lately acquired charger, an attachment which seemed to attain new strength from every fresh example of the animal's ferocious and demon-like propensities, at length became, in the eyes of all reasonable men, a hideous and unnatural fervor. In the glare of noon, at the dead hour of night, in sickness or in health, in calm or in tempest, the young Metzengerstein seemed riveted to the saddle of that colossal horse, whose intractable audacity so well accorded with his own spirit. There were circumstances, moreover, which, coupled with late events, gave an unearthly and portentous character to the mania of the rider and to the capabilities of the steed. The space passed over in a single leap had been accurately measured, and was found to exceed by an astounding difference the wildest expectations of the most imaginative. The baron, besides, had no particular name for the animal, although the rest in his collection were distinguished by characteristic appellations. His stable, too, was appointed at a distance from the rest, and with regard to grooming and other necessary offices, none but the owner in person had ventured to officiate, or even to enter the enclosure of that particular stall. It was also to be observed that although the three grooms, who had caught the steed as he fled from the conflagration at Berlifitzing, had succeeded in arresting his course by means of a chain bridle and noose, yet no one of the three could with any certainty affirm that he had, during the dangerous struggle, or at any period thereafter, actually placed his hand upon the body of the beast. Instances of peculiar intelligence in the demeanor of a noble and high-spirited horse are not supposed to be capable of exciting unreasonable attention, especially among men who, daily trained to the labors of the chase, might appear well acquainted with the sagacity of a horse. But there were certain circumstances which truded themselves perforce upon the most skeptical and phlegmatic, and it is said there were times when the animal caused the gaping crowd who stood around to recoil in horror from the deep and impressive meaning of his terrible stamp. Times when the young Metzengerstein turned pale and shrunk away from the rapid and searching expression of his earnest and human-looking eye. Among all the retinue of the Baron, however, none were found to doubt the ardor of that extraordinary affection which existed on the part of the young nobleman for the fiery qualities of his horse. At least none but an insignificant and misshapen little page, whose deformities were in everybody's way, and whose opinions were of the least possible importance. He, if his ideas are worth mentioning at all, had the effrontery to assert that his master never vaulted into the saddle without an accountable and almost imperceptible shudder, and that upon his return from every long-continued and habitual ride an expression of triumphant malignity distorted every muscle in his countenance. One tempestuous night, Metzengerstein, awakening from a heavy slumber, descended like a maniac from his chambers, and mounting in hot haste, bounded into the mazes of the forest. An occurrence so common attracted no particular attention, but his return was looked for with intense anxiety on the part of his domestics, when, after some hours' absence, the stupendous and magnificent battlements of the Chateau Metzengerstein were discovered, crackling and rocking to their very foundation, under the influence of a dense and livid mass of ungovernable fire. As the flames, when first seen, had already made so terrible a progress that all efforts to save any portion of the building were evidently futile, the astonished neighborhood stood idly around in silent and pathetic wonder. But a new and fearful object soon riveted the attention of the multitude, and proved how much more intense is the excitement wrought in the feelings of a crowd by the contemplation of human agony than that brought about by the most appalling spectacles of inanimate matter. Up the long avenue of aged oaks, which led from the forest to the main entrance of the Chateau Metzengerstein, a steed, bearing an unbonneted and disordered rider, was seen leaping with an impetuosity which outstripped the very demon of the tempest. The career of the horseman was indisputably, on his own part, uncontrollable. The agony of his countenance, the convulsive struggle of his frame, gave evidence of superhuman exertion, but no sound, save a solitary shriek, escaped from his lacerated lips, which were bitten through and through in the intensity of terror. One instant, and the clattering of hoofs resounded sharply and shrilly above the roaring of the flames and the shrieking of the wind. Another, and clearing at a single plunge the gateway and the moat, the steed bounded far up the tottering staircases of the palace, and, with its rider, disappeared amid the whirlwind of chaotic fire. The fury of the tempest immediately died away, and a dead calm sullenly succeeded. A white flame still enveloped the building like a shroud, and streaming far away into the quiet atmosphere, shot forth a glare of preternatural light, while a cloud of smoke settled heavily over the battlements in the distinct colossal figure of a horse. Philadelphia Saturday Courier, January 14th, 1832. The Duc de l'Omelette. Keats fell by a criticism. Who was it died of the Andromache? Ignoble souls. De l'Omelette perished of an ortolan. L'histoire en est. Assist me, spirit of Apicius. A golden cage bore the little winged wanderer, enamored, melting, indolent, to the Chaussée d'Antin from its home in far Peru. From its queenly possessor, La Bellissima, to the Duc de l'Omelette, 6 peers of the empire conveyed the happy bird. That night the Duke was to sup alone. In the privacy of his bureau, he reclined languidly on that ottoman for which he sacrificed his loyalty in outbidding his king, the notorious ottoman of Cadet. He buries his face in the pillow. The clock strikes. Unable to restrain his feelings, his grace swallows an olive. At this moment the door gently opens to the sound of soft music, and lo! The most delicate of birds is before the most enamored of men. But what inexpressible dismay now overshadows the countenance of the Duke? Aurel! Chien! Baptiste! Lazare! Oh, bon Dieu! Cet oiseau modeste que tu as déshabillé de ses plumes, et que tu as servi sans papier. It is superfluous to say more. The Duke expired in a paroxysm of disgust. Ha, 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 said his Grace on the third day after his decease. He, replied the devil faintly, drawing himself up with an air of hauteur. Why, surely you're not serious, retorted de L'Omelette. I have sinned, c'est vrai. But, my good sir, consider. You have no actual intention of putting such barbarous threats into execution. No what? Said his Majesty. Come, sir, strip. Strip, indeed. Very pretty, I faith. No, sir, I shall not strip. Who are you, pray, that I, Duke de L'Omelette, Prince de Fagua, just come of age, author of the Mazurkiad, and member of the Academy, should divest myself at your bidding of the sweetest pantaloons ever made by Bourdon, the daintiest robe de chambre ever put together by Rambert, to say nothing of the taking my hair out of paper, not to mention the trouble I should have in drawing off my gloves. Who am I? Ah, true. I am Beelzebub, Prince of the Fly. I took thee, just now, from a rosewood coffin inlaid with ivory. Thou wast curiously scented and labelled as per invoice. Belial sent thee, my inspector of cemeteries. The pantaloons, which thou sayest were made by Bourdon, are an excellent pair of linen drawers, and thy robe de chambre is a shroud of no scanty dimensions. Sir, replied the Duke, I am not to be insulted with impunity. Sir, I shall take the earliest opportunity of avenging this insult. Sir, you shall hear from me. In the meantime, au revoir. And the Duke was bowing himself out of the satanic presence when he was interrupted and brought back by a gentleman in waiting. Hereupon his Grace rubbed his eyes, yawned, shrugged his shoulders, reflected. Having become satisfied of his identity, he took a bird's-eye view of his whereabouts. The apartment was superb. Even de L'Omelette pronounced it bien comme il faut. It was not its length, nor its breadth, but its height. Ah, that was appalling. There was no ceiling, certainly none, but a dense, whirling mass of fiery-colored clouds. His Grace's brain reeled as he glanced upward. From above hung a chain of an unknown blood-red metal, its upper end lost, like the city of Boston, parmi les nues. From its nether extremity swung a large crescent. The Duke knew it to be a ruby, but from it there poured a light so intense, so still, so terrible. Persia never worshipped such. Geber never imagined such. Mussulman never dreamed of such when, drugged with opium, he has tottered to a bed of poppies, his back to the flowers, and his face to the god Apollo. The Duke muttered a slight oath, decidedly approbatory. The corners of the room were rounded into niches. 3 of these were filled with statues of gigantic proportions. Their beauty was Grecian, their deformity Egyptian, their tout ensemble French. In the 4th niche, the statue was veiled. It was not colossal. But then there was a taper ankle, a sandaled foot. De L'Omelette pressed his hand upon his heart, closed his eyes, raised them, and caught his satanic majesty in a blush. But the paintings! Cupris, Astarte, Astoreth, 1,000 and the same. And Raphael has beheld them. Yes, Raphael has been here, for did he not paint the... And was he not consequently damned? The paintings! The paintings! Oh, luxury! Oh, love! Who, gazing on these forbidden beauties, shall have eyes for their dainty devices of the golden frames that be sprinkled like stars, the hyacinth, and the porphyry walls? But the Duke's heart is fainting within him. He is not, however, as you suppose, dizzy with magnificence, nor drunk with the ecstatic breath of those innumerable censers. C'est vrai que de toutes ces choses il pense beaucoup, mais the Duc de l'Omelette is terror-stricken. For, through the lurid vista which a single uncurtained window is affording, lo, gleams the most ghastly of all fires. Le pauvre Duc. He could not help imagining that the glorious, the voluptuous, the never-dying melodies which pervaded the hall as they passed, filtered, and transmuted through the alchemy of the enchanted window-panes, were the wailings and the howlings of the hopeless and the damned. And there, too, there, upon the ottoman, who could he be? He, the petit maître. No, the deity, who sat as if carved in marble, et qui sourit, with his pale countenance, si amerement. Mais il faut agir. That is to say, a Frenchman never faints outright. Besides, his grace hated a scene. De l'Omelette is himself again. There were some foils upon a table, some points also. The Duc s'échappe. He measures 2 points, and, with a grace inimitable, offers His Majesty the choice. Horreur! His Majesty does not fence. Mais il joue. How happy a thought! But His Grace had always an excellent memory. He had dipped in the Diable of Abbé Galtier. Therein it is said, que le diable n'ose pas refuser un jet de cartes. But the chances, true, desperate, but scarcely more desperate than the Duke. Besides, was he not in the secret? Had he not skimmed over Père le Brun? Was he not a member of the club Vendôme? Si je perds, said he, je serai 2 fois perdu. I shall be doubly damned. Voilà tout. Here His Grace shrugged his shoulders. Si je gagne, je reviendrai à mes Allan. Que les cartes soient préparées. His Grace was all care, all attention. His Majesty, all confidence. A spectator would have thought of Francis and Charles. His Grace thought of his game. His Majesty did not think. He shuffled. The Duke cut. The cards were dealt. The trump is turned. It is the King! No, it was the Queen. His Majesty cursed her masculine habiliments. De l'Omelette placed his hand upon his heart. They play. The Duke counts. The hand is out. His Majesty counts heavily, smiles, and is taking wine. The Duke slips a card. C'est à vous à faire, said His Majesty, cutting. His Grace bowed, dealt, and arose from the table, and présentant le roi. His Majesty looked chagrined. Had Alexander not been Alexander, he would have been Diogenes. And the Duke assured his antagonist, in taking leave, que s'il n'eût été de l'Omelette, il n'aurait point d'objection d'être le diable. A Tale of Jerusalem. Let us hurry to the walls, said Abel Pittam to Buzzy ben Levi and Simeon the Pharisee, on the 10th day of the month Thazum, in the year of the world 3941. Let us hasten to the ramparts adjoining the gate of Benjamin, which is in the city of David, and overlooking the camp of the uncircumcised, for it is the last hour of the 4th watch, being sunrise. And the idolaters, in fulfillment of the promise of Pompey, should be awaiting us with the lambs for the sacrifices. Simeon, Abel Pittam, and Duzzy ben Levi were the Gizbarim, or sub-collectors of the offering in the holy city of Jerusalem. Verily, replied the Pharisee, let us hasten, for this generosity in the heathen is unwonted, and fickle-mindedness has ever been an attribute of the worshippers of Baal. That they are fickle-minded and treacherous is as true as the Pentateuch, said Buzzy ben Levi, but that is only toward the people of Adonai. When was it ever known that the Ammonites proved wanting to their own interests? Methinks it is no great stretch of generosity to allow us lambs for the altar of the Lord, receiving in lieu thereof 30 silver shekels per head. Thou forgettest, however, Ben Levi, replied Abel Pittam, that the Roman Pompey, who is now impiously besieging the city of the Most High, has no assurity that we apply not the lambs thus purchased for the altar to the sustenance of the body rather than of the spirit. Now, by the 5 corners of my beard, shouted the Pharisee, who belonged to the sect called the Dashers, that little knot of saints whose manner of dashing and lacerating the feet against the pavement was long a thorn and a reproach to less zealous devotees, a stumbling block to less gifted perambulators. By the 5 corners of that beard which, as a priest, I am forbidden to shave. Have we lived to see the day when a blaspheming and idolatrous upstart of Rome shall accuse us of appropriating to the appetites of the flesh the most holy and consecrated elements? Have we lived to see the day when— Let us not question the motives of the Philistine, interrupted Abel Pittum, for today we profit, for the first time, by his avarice, or by his generosity. But rather let us hurry to the ramparts, lest offerings should be wanting for that altar, whose fire the rains of heaven cannot extinguish, and whose pillars of smoke no tempest can turn aside. That part of the city to which our worthy Gizbarim now hastened, and which bore the name of its architect, King David, was esteemed the most strongly fortified district of Jerusalem, being situated upon the steep and lofty hill of Zion. Here a broad, deep, circumvallatory trench, hewn from the solid rock, was defended by a wall of great strength, erected upon its inner edge. This wall was adorned, at regular interspaces, by square towers of white marble, the lowest 60, and the highest 120 cubits in height. But in the vicinity of the gate of Benjamin, the wall arose by no means from the margin of the fossa. On the contrary, between the level of the ditch and the basement of the rampart sprang up a perpendicular cliff of 250 cubits, forming part of the precipitous Mount Moriah, so that when Simeon and his associates arrived on the summit of the tower called Adonai Bezik, the loftiest of all the turrets around about Jerusalem, and the usual place of conference with the besieging army, they looked down upon the camp of the enemy, from an eminence excelling by many feet that of the pyramid Cheops, and by several that of the temple of Belus. Verily, sighed the Pharisee as he peered dizzily over the precipice, the uncircumcised are as the sands by the seashore, as the locusts in the wilderness. The valley of the king hath become the valley of Adamon. And yet, added Ben Livy, thou canst not point me out a Philistine, no, not one, from Aleph to Tau, from the wilderness to the battlements, who seemeth any bigger than the letter Jod. Lower away the basket with the shekels of silver! Here shouted a Roman soldier in a hoarse, rough voice, which appeared to issue from the regions of Pluto. Lower away the basket with the accursed coin which it has broken the jaw of a noble Roman to pronounce. Is it thus you evince your gratitude to our master Pompeius, who in his condescension has thought fit to listen to your idolatrous importunities? The god Phoebus, who is a true god, has been charioted for an hour. And were you not to be on the ramparts by sunrise? Adepol, do you think that we, the conquerors of the world, have nothing better to do than stand waiting by the walls of every kennel to traffic with the dogs of the earth? Lower away, I say, and see that your trumpery be bright in color and just in weight. Elohim! Ejaculated the Pharisee, as the discordant tones of the centurion rattled up the crags of the precipice and fainted away against the temple. Elohim! Who is the god, Phoebus? Whom doth the blasphemer invoke? Thou Buzzy Ben Levi, who art read in the laws of the Gentiles, and hast sojourned among them, who dabbled with the teraphim. Is it Nergal of whom the idolater speaketh? Or Ashima? Or Nibez? Or Tartak? Or Adramelech? Or Anamelech? Or Sakathbeneth? Or Dagon? Or Belial? Or Baal-Perith? Or Baal-Pera? Or Baal-Zebub? Verily it is neither. But beware, how thou lettest the rope slip too rapidly through thy fingers. For should the wicker-work change to hang on the projection of yonder crag, there will be a woeful outpouring of the holy things of the sanctuary. By the assistance of some rudely constructed machinery, the heavy laden basket was now carefully lowered down among the multitude, and from the giddy pinnacle the Romans were seen gathering confusedly round it. But owing to the vast height and the prevalence of a fog, no distinct view of their operations could be obtained. Half an hour had already elapsed. "We shall be too late," sighed the Pharisee, as at the expiration of this period he looked over into the abyss. "We shall be too late. We shall be turned out of the office by the Catullum." "No more," responded Abel Pittum. "No more shall we feast upon the fat of the land. No longer shall our beards be odorous with frankincense, our loins girded up with fine linen from the temple." "Racal!" swore Ben Levi. "Racal, do they mean to defraud us of the purchase money? Or, holy Moses, are they weighing the shekels of the tabernacle?" "They had given us the signal, at last!" cried the Pharisee. "They have given us the signal, at last! Pull away, Abel Pittum! And thou, Buzzy Ben Levi, pull away! For verily, the Philistines have either still hold upon the basket, or the Lord hath softened their hearts to place therein a beast of good weight." And the Gizbarim pulled away while their burden swung heavily upward through the still increasing mist. "Bouchon! As at the conclusion of an hour, some object at the extremity of the rope became indistinctly visible. "Bouchon!" was the exclamation which burst from the lips of Ben Levi. "Bouchon! For shame! It is a ram from the thickets of En-Gedi, and as rugged as the valley of Jehoshaphat." "It is a firstling of the flock," said Abel Pittum. "I know him by the bleating of his lips and the innocent folding of his limbs. His eyes are more beautiful than the jewels of the pectoral, and his flesh is like the honey of Hebron." "It is a fatted calf from the pastures of Bashan," said the Pharisee. "The heathen have dealt wonderfully with us. Let us raise up our voices in a psalm. Let us give thanks on the shawm, and on the psaltery, on the harp, and on the hugab, on the citharon, and on the sackbut." It was not until the basket had arrived within a few feet of the Gizbarim that a low grunt betrayed to their perception a hog of no common size. "Now, Alimanu!" slowly and with upturned eyes ejaculated the trio, as letting go their hold, the emancipated porker tumbled headlong among the Philistines. "Alimanu! God be with us! It is the unutterable flesh!" Philadelphia Saturday Courier, June 9th, 1832. Loss of breath. The most notorious ill fortune must in the end yield to the untiring courage of philosophy, as the most stubborn city to the ceaseless vigilance of an enemy. Shalmaneser, as we have it in holy writings, lay 3 years before Samaria, yet it fell. Sardanapalus, see Diodorus, maintained himself 7 in Nineveh, but to no purpose. Troy expired at the close of the second lustrum, and Azoth, as Aristeas declares upon his honor as a gentleman, opened at last her gates to Psammetichus, after having barred them for the 5th part of a century. "Thou wretch! Thou vixen! Thou shrew!" I said to my wife on the morning after our wedding. "Thou witch! Thou hag! Thou whippersnapper! Thou sink of iniquity! Thou fiery-faced quintessence of all that is abominable! Thou! Here, standing upon tiptoe, seizing her by the throat, and placing my mouth close to her ear, I was preparing to launch forth a new and more decided epithet of opprobrium, which should not fail, if ejaculated to convince her of her insignificance, when, to my extreme horror and astonishment, I discovered that I had lost my breath. The phrases, "I am out of breath," "I have lost my breath," etc., are often enough repeated in common conversation, but it had never occurred to me that the terrible accident of which I speak could bona fide and actually happen. Imagine, that is, if you have a fanciful turn, Imagine, I say, my wonder, my consternation, my despair. There is a good genius, however, which has never entirely deserted me. In my most ungovernable moods, I still retain a sense of propriety. Et le chemin de passion me conduit, as Lord Edward in the Julie says it did him, à la philosophie véritable. Although I could not at first precisely ascertain to what degree the occurrence had affected me, I determined, at all events, to conceal the matter from my wife, until further experience should discover to me the extent of this my unheard-of calamity. Altering my countenance, therefore, in a moment from its bepuffed and distorted appearance to an expression of arch and coquettish benignity, I gave my lady a pat on the one cheek and a kiss on the other, and without saying one syllable, furies, I could not, left her astonished at my drollery as I pirouetted out of the room in a pas de se faire. Behold me then safely ensconced in my private boudoir, a fearful instance of the ill consequences attending upon irascibility, alive with the qualifications of the dead, dead with the propensities of the living, an anomaly on the face of the earth, being very calm, yet breathless. Yes, breathless. I am serious in asserting that my breath was entirely gone. I could not have stirred with it a feather if my life had been an issue, or sullied even the delicacy of a mirror. Hard fate! Yet there was some alleviation to my first overwhelming paroxysm of my sorrow. I found upon trial that the powers of utterance, which upon my inability to proceed in the conversation with my wife, I then concluded to be totally destroyed, were, in fact, only partially impeded, and I discovered that had I, at the interesting crisis, dropped my voice to a singularly deep guttural, I might still have continued to her the communication of my sentiments. This pitch of voice, the guttural, depending, I find not upon the current of the breath, but upon a certain spasmodic action of the muscles of the throat. Throwing myself upon a chair, I remained for some time absorbed in meditation. My reflections, be sure, were of no consolatory kind. 1,000 vague and lachrymatory fancies took possession of my soul, and even the idea of suicide flitted across my brain. But it is a trait in the perversity of human nature to reject the obvious and the ready, for the far distant and equivocal. Thus I shuddered at self-murder as the most decided of atrocities, while the tabby cat purred strenuously upon the rug, and the very water-dog wheezed assiduously under the table, each taking to itself much merit for the strength of its lungs, and all obviously done in derision of my own pulmonary incapacity. Oppressed with a tumult of vague hopes and fears, I at length heard the footsteps of my wife descending the staircase. Being now assured of her absence, I returned with a palpitating heart to the scene of my disaster. Carefully locking the door on the inside, I commenced a vigorous search. It was possible, I thought, that concealed in some obscure corner, or lurking in some closet or drawer, might be found the lost object of my inquiry. It might have a vapory, it might even have a tangible form. Most philosophers, upon many points of philosophy, are still very unphilosophical. William Godwin, however, says in his Mandeville that invisible things are the only realities, and this, all will allow, is a case in point. I would have the judicious reader pause before accusing such asseverations of an undue quantum of absurdity. Anaxagoras, it will be remembered, maintained the snow is black, and this I have since found to be the case. Long and earnestly did I continue the investigation, but the contemptible reward of my industry and perseverance proved to be only a set of false teeth, 2 pair of hips, an eye, and a bundle of billet doux from Mr. Windenough to my wife. I might as well here observe that this confirmation of my lady's partiality for Mr. W. occasioned me little uneasiness. That Mrs. Lackobreath should admire anything so dissimilar to myself was a natural and necessary evil. I am, it is well known, of a robust and corpulent appearance, and at the same time somewhat diminutive in stature. What wonder, then, that the lath-like tenuity of my acquaintance, and his altitude, which has grown into a proverb, should have met with all due estimation in the eyes of Mrs. Lackobreath. But to return. My exertions, as I have before said, proved fruitless. Closet after closet, drawer after drawer, corner after corner, were scrutinized to no purpose. At one time, however, I thought myself sure of my prize, having, in rummaging a dressing case, accidentally demolished a bottle of Grand Jean's Oil of Archangels, which, as an agreeable perfume, I here take the liberty of recommending. With a heavy heart, I returned to my boudoir, there to ponder upon some method of eluding my wife's penetration until I could make arrangements prior to my leaving the country, for to this I had already made up my mind. In a foreign climate, being unknown, I might, with some probability of success, endeavor to conceal my unhappy calamity. A calamity calculated even more than beggary, to estrange the affections of the multitude and to draw down upon the wretch the well-merited indignation of the virtuous and the happy. I was not long in hesitation. Being naturally quick, I committed to memory the entire tragedy of Metamora. I had the good fortune to recollect that in the accentuation of this drama, or at least of such portion of it as it allotted to the hero, the tones of voice in which I found myself deficient were altogether unnecessary, and the deep guttural was expected to reign monotonously throughout. I practised for some time by the borders of a well-frequented marsh. Herein, however, having no reference to a similar proceeding of Demosthenes, but from a design peculiarly and conscientiously my own. Thus armed at all points, I determined to make my wife believe that I was suddenly smitten with a passion for the stage. In this I succeeded to a miracle, and to every question or suggestion found myself at liberty to reply in my frog-like and sepulchral tones with some passage from the tragedy, any portion of which, as I soon took great pleasure in observing, would apply equally well to any particular subject. It is not to be supposed, however, that in the delivery of such passages I was found at all deficient in the looking asquint, the showing my teeth, the working my knees, the shuffling my feet, or in any of those unmentionable graces which are now justly considered the characteristics of a popular performer. To be sure, they spoke of confining me in a straitjacket. But, good God, they never suspected me of having lost my breath. Having at length put my affairs in order, I took my seat very early one morning in the mail stage, for giving it to be understood among my acquaintances that business of the last importance required my immediate personal attendance in that city. The coach was crammed to repletion, but in the uncertain twilight the features of my companions could not be distinguished. Without making any effectual resistance, I suffered myself to be placed between two gentlemen of colossal dimensions, while a third, of a size larger, requesting pardon for the liberty he was about to take, threw himself upon my body at full length, and falling asleep in an instant, drowned all my guttural ejaculations for relief, in a snore which would have put to blush the roarings of the bull of Phalaris. Happily, the state of my respiratory faculties rendered suffocation and accident entirely out of the question. As, however, the day broke more distinctly in our approach to the outskirts of the city, my tormentor, arising and adjusting his shirt collar, thanked me in a very friendly manner for my civility. All my limbs were dislocated, and my head twisted on one side. His apprehensions began to be excited, and arousing the rest of the passengers, he communicated in a very decided manner his opinion that a dead man had been palmed upon them during the night for a living and responsible fellow traveler, here by giving me a thump on the right eye, by way of demonstrating the truth of his suggestion. Hereupon all, one after another, there were 9 in company, believed it their duty to pull me by the ear. A young practicing physician, too, having applied a pocket mirror to my mouth, and found me without breath. The assertion of my persecutor was pronounced a true bill, and the whole party expressed a determination to endure tamely no such impositions for the future, and to proceed no farther with any such carcasses for the present. I was here accordingly, thrown out at the sign of the Crow, by which tavern the coach happened to be passing, without meeting with any farther accidents than the breaking of both my arms under the left hind wheel of the vehicle. I must besides do the driver the justice to state that he did not forget to throw after me the largest of my trunks, which, unfortunately, falling on my head, fractured my skull in a manner at once interesting and extraordinary. The landlord of the Crow, who is a hospitable man, finding that my trunk contained sufficient to indemnify him for any little trouble he might take in my behalf, sent forthwith for a surgeon of his acquaintance, and delivered me to his care with a bill and receipt for $10. The purchaser took me to his apartments and commenced operations immediately. Having cut off my ears, however, he discovered signs of animation. He now rang the bell, and sent for a neighboring apothecary with whom to consult in the emergency. In case of his suspicions with regard to my existence proving ultimately correct, he, in the meantime, made an incision in my stomach and removed several of my viscera for private dissection. The apothecary had an idea that I was actually dead. The idea I endeavored to confute, kicking and plunging with all my might, and making the most furious contortions, for the operations of the surgeon had, in a measure, restored me to the possessions of my faculties. All, however, was attributed to the effects of a new galvanic battery, wherewith the apothecary, who is really a man of information, performed several curious experiments, in which, from my personal share in their fulfillment, I could not help feeling deeply interested. It was a course of mortification to me, nevertheless, that although I made several attempts at conversation, my powers of speech were so entirely in abeyance that I could not even open my mouth, much less than make reply to some ingenious but fanciful theories of which, under other circumstances, my minute acquaintance with the Hippocratian pathology would have afforded me a ready confutation. Not being able to arrive at a conclusion, the practitioners remanded me for farther examination. I was taken up into a garret, and the surgeon's lady having accommodated me with drawers and stockings, the surgeon himself fastened my hands and tied up my jaws with a pocket handkerchief, then bolted the door on the outside as he hurried to his dinner, leaving me alone to silence and to meditation. I now discovered, to my extreme delight, that I could have spoken had not my mouth been tied up with a pocket handkerchief. Consoling myself with this reflection, I was mentally repeating some passages of the omnipresence of the deity, as is my custom before resigning myself to sleep, when two cats of a greedy and vituperative turn, entering a hole in the wall, leaped up with a flourish a la Catalani, and alighting opposite one another on my visage, betook themselves to indecorous contention for the paltry consideration of my nose. But as the loss of his ears proved the meanings of elevating to the throne of Cyrus, the Magian or Maj Gush of Persia, and as the cutting off his nose gave Zopyrus possession of Babylon, so the losses of a few ounces of my countenance proved the salvation of my body. Aroused by the pain and burning with indignation, I burst at a single effort the fastenings and the bandage. Stalking across the room, I cast a glance of contempt at the belligerents, and throwing open the sash to their extreme horror and disappointment, precipitated myself very dexterously from the window, this moment passing from the city jail to the scaffold erected for his execution in the suburbs. His extreme infirmity and long-continued ill health had obtained him the privilege of remaining unmanacled, and habited in his gallows costume, one very similar to my own, he lay at full length in the bottom of the hangman's cart, which happened to be under the windows of the surgeon at the moment of my precipitation, without any other guard than the driver, who was asleep, and two recruits of the 6th Infantry, who were drunk. As ill luck would have it, I alit upon my feet within the vehicle. Immediately he bolted out behind, and turning down an alley, was out of sight in the twinkling of an eye. The recruits, aroused by the bustle, could not exactly comprehend the merits of the transaction. Seeing, however, a man, the precise counterpart of the felon, standing upright in the cart before their eyes, they were of, so they expressed themselves, and having communicated this opinion to one another, they each took a dram, and then knocked me down with the butt ends of their muskets. It was not long ere we arrived at the place of destination. Of course, nothing could be said in my defense. Hanging was my inevitable fate. I resigned myself thereto with a feeling half stupid, half acrimonious. Being a little of a cynic, I had all the sentiments of a dog. The hangman, however, adjusted the noose about my neck. The drop fell. I forbear to depict my sensations upon the gallows, although here, undoubtedly, I could speak to the point, and it is a topic upon which nothing has been well said. In fact, to write upon such a theme, it is necessary to have been hanged. Every author should confine himself to matters of experience. Thus, Mark Antony composed a treatise upon getting drunk. I may just mention, however, that die I did not. My body was, but I had no breath to be, suspended, and but for the knot under my left ear, which had the feel of a military stock, I dare say that I should have experienced very little inconvenience. As for the jerk given to my neck upon the falling of the drop, it merely proved a corrective to the twist afforded me by the fat gentleman in the coach. For good reasons, however, I did my best to give the crowd the worth of their trouble. My convulsions were said to be extraordinary. My spasms it would have been difficult to beat. The populace encored, several gentlemen swooned, and a multitude of ladies were carried home in hysterics. Pintix availed himself of the opportunity to retouch from a sketch taken upon the spot his admirable painting of the Marseillaise flayed alive. When I had afforded sufficient amusement, it was thought proper to remove my body from the gallows. This the more specially, as the real culprit had in the meantime been retaken and recognized, a fact which I was so unlucky as not to know. Much sympathy was, of course, exercised in my behalf, and, as no one made claim to my corpse, it was ordered that I should be interred in a public vault. Here, after due interval, I was deposited, the sexton departed, and I was left alone. A line of Marston's Malcontent. Death's a good fellow and keeps open house, struck me at the moment as a palpable lie. I knocked off, however, the lid of my coffin and stepped out. The place was dreadfully dreary and damp, and I became troubled with ennui. By way of amusement, I felt my way among the numerous coffins ranged in order around. I lifted them down one by one, and breaking open their lids, busied myself in speculations about the mortality within. "This," I soliloquized, tumbling over a carcass, puffy, bloated, and rotund, "this has been no doubt in every sense of the word an unhappy and unfortunate man. It has been his terrible lot not to walk but to waddle, to pass through life not like a human being but like an elephant, not like a man but like a rhinoceros. His attempts at getting on have been a mere abortions, and his circumgyratory proceedings a palpable failure. Taking a step forward, it has been his misfortune to take 2 toward the right and 3 toward the left. His studies have been confined to the poetry of Crabbe. He can have no idea of the wonder of a pirouette. To him, a pas de papillon has been an abstract conception. He has never ascended the summit of a hill. He has never viewed from any steeple the glories of a metropolis. Heat has been his mortal enemy. In the dog days, his days have been the days of a dog. Therein, he has dreamed of flames and suffocation, of mountains upon mountains, of Pelion upon Ossa. He was short of breath. To say all in one word, he was short of breath. He thought it extravagant to play upon wind instruments. He was the inventor of self-moving fans, wind sails, and ventilators. He patronized DuPont, the bellows maker, and he died miserably in attempting to smoke a cigar. His was a case in which I feel a deep interest, a lot in which I sincerely sympathize. "But here," said I, "here," and I dragged spitefully from its receptacle a gaunt, tall, and peculiar-looking form, whose remarkable appearance struck me with a sense of unwelcome familiarity. "Here is a wretch entitled to no earthly commiseration." Thus saying, in order to obtain a more distinct view of my subject, I applied my thumb and forefinger to its nose, and, causing it to assume a sitting position upon the ground, held it thus, at the length of my arm, while I continued my soliloquy. "Entitled," I repeated, "to no earthly commiseration. Who indeed would think of compassioning a shadow? Besides, has he not had his full shares of the blessings of mortality? He was the originator of tall monuments, shot towers, lightning rods, Lombardy poplars. His treatise upon shades and shadows has immortalized him. He edited with distinguished ability the last edition of South on the Bones. He went early to college, and studied pneumatics. Then he came home, talked eternally, and played upon the French horn. He patronized the bagpipes. Captain Barclay, who walked against time, would not walk against him. Wyndham and Albrecht were his favorite writers. His favorite artist, Phiz. He died gloriously while inhaling gas. Levique flatur corrupitur, like the fama pudicite in Hieronymus. He was indubitably a— "How can you? How can you?" interrupted the object of my animadversions, gasping for breath and tearing off, with a desperate exertion, the bandage around its jaw. "How can you, Mr. Lacobreth, be so infernally cruel as to pinch me in that manner by the nose? Did you not see how they fastened up my mouth? And you must know, if you know anything, how vast a superfluity of breath I have to dispose of. If you do not know, however, sit down and you shall see. In my situation, it is really a great relief to be able to open one's mouth, to be able to expatiate, to be able to communicate with a person like yourself, who do not think yourself called upon at every period to interrupt the thread of a gentleman's discourse. Interruptions are annoying and should undoubtedly be abolished. Don't you think so? No reply, I beg you. One person is enough to be speaking at a time. I shall be done by and by, and then you may begin. How the devil, sir, did you get into this place? Not a word, I beseech you. Been here some time myself. Terrible accident. Heard of it, I suppose? Awful calamity. Walking under your windows. Some short while ago. About the time you were stage-struck. Horrible occurrence. Heard of catching one's breath, eh? Hold your tongue, I tell you. I caught someone else's. Had always too much of my own. Met Blab at the corner of the street. Wouldn't give me a chance for a word. Couldn't get in a syllable edgeways. Attacked consequently with leprosy. Blab made his escape. Damn old fools! They took me up for dead and put me in this place. Pretty doings, all of them. Heard all of you said about me. Every word a lie. Horrible, wonderful, outrageous, hideous, incomprehensible, etc., 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 etc. It is impossible to conceive my astonishment at so unexpected a discourse, or the joy of which I became gradually convinced that the breath, so fortunately caught by the gentleman, whom I soon recognized as my neighbor Windenough, was in fact the identical expiration mislaid by myself in the conversation with my wife. Time, place, and circumstances rendered it a matter beyond question. I did not, at least, during the long period in which the inventor of the Lombardy poplars continued to favor me with his explanations. In this respect I was actuated by the habitual prudence which has ever been my predominating trait. I reflected that many difficulties might still lie in the path of my preservation, which only extreme exertion on my part would be able to surmount. Many persons, I considered, are prone to estimate commodities in their possession, however valueless to the then proprietor, however troublesome or distressing, in direct ratio with the advantages to be derived by others from their attainment, or by themselves from their abandonment. Might not this be the case with Mr. Windenough? In displaying anxiety for the breath of which he was at present so willing to get rid, might I not lay myself open to the exactions of his avarice? There are scoundrels in this world, I remembered with a sigh, who will not scruple to take unfair opportunities with even a next-door neighbor. And this remark is from Epictetus. It is precisely at that time when men are most anxious to throw off the burden of their own calamities that they feel the least desirous of relieving them in others. Upon considerations similar to these, and still retaining my grasp upon the nose of Mr. W., I accordingly thought proper to model my reply. "Monster!" I began in a tone of the deepest indignation. "Monster and double-winded idiot! Dost thou, whom for thine iniquities it has pleased heaven to accurse with a twofold reception? Dost thou, I say, presume to address me in the familiar language of an old acquaintance? I lie, forsooth, and hold my tongue, to be sure. Pretty conversation indeed to a gentleman with a single breath. All this, too, when I have it in my power to relieve the calamity under which thou dost so justly suffer, to curtail the superfluities of thine unhappy respiration." Like Brutus, I paused for a reply, with which, like a tornado, Mr. Windenough immediately overwhelmed me. Protestation followed upon protestation, and apology upon apology. There were no terms with which he was unwilling to comply, and there were none of which I failed to take the fullest advantage. Preliminaries being at length arranged, my acquaintance delivered me the respiration, for which, having carefully examined it, I gave him afterward a receipt. I am aware that by many I shall be held to blame for speaking in a manner of so cursory, of a transaction so impalpable. It will be thought that I should have entered more minutely into the details of an occurrence by which, and this is very true, much new light might be thrown upon a highly interesting branch of physical philosophy. To all this I am sorry that I cannot reply. A hint is the only answer which I am permitted to make. There were circumstances, but I think it much safer upon consideration to say as little as possible about an affair so delicate I repeat, and at the time involving the interests of a third party whose sulphurous resentment I have not the least desire at this moment of incurring. We were not long after this necessary arrangement in effecting an escape from the dungeons of the sepulchre. The united strength of our resuscitated voices was soon sufficiently apparent. Scissors, the Whig editor, republished a treatise upon the nature and origin of subterranean noises. A reply, rejoinder, confutation, and justification followed in the columns of a democratic gazette. It was not until the opening of the vault to decide the controversy that the appearance of Mr. Windenough and myself proved both parties to have been decidedly in the wrong. I cannot conclude these details of some very singular passages in a life at all times sufficiently eventful, without again recalling to the attention of the reader the merits of that indiscriminate philosophy which is a sure and ready shield against those shafts of calamity which can neither be seen, felt, nor fully understood. It was in the spirit of this wisdom that, among the ancient Hebrews, it was believed the gates of heaven would be inevitably opened to that sinner or saint who, with good lungs and implicit confidence, should vociferate the word Amen. It was in the spirit of this wisdom that, when a great plague raged at Athens, and every means had been in vain attempted for its removal, Epimenides, as Learchus relates in his second book of that philosopher, advised the erection of a shrine and temple to the proper God. Philadelphia Saturday Courier, November 10th, 1832. Bonbon. That Pierre Bonbon was a restaurateur of uncommon qualifications. No man who, during the reign of, frequented the little café in the cul-de-sac La Febre at Rouen, will, I imagine, feel himself at liberty to dispute that Pierre Bonbon was, in an equal degree, skilled in the philosophy of that period is, I presume, still more especially undeniable. His pâtés à la fois were beyond doubt immaculate. But what pen can do justice to his essays sur la nature, his thoughts sur la mer, his observations sur l'esprit? If his omelettes, if his fricandeau were inestimable, what littérateur of that day would not have given twice as much for an idée de bonbon as for all the trash of idées of all the rest of the savants? Bonbon had ransacked libraries, which no other man had ransacked, had more than any other would have entertained a notion of reading, had understood more than any other would have conceived the possibility of understanding, and although, while he flourished, there were not wanting some authors at Rouen to assert that his dicta evinced neither the purity of the Academy nor the depth of the Lyceum, although, mark me, his doctrines were no means very generally comprehensible, still it did not follow that they were very difficult of comprehension. It was, I think, on account of their self-evidency that many persons were led to consider them abstruse. It is to Bonbon, but let this go no farther. It is to Bonbon that Kant himself is mainly indebted for his metaphysics. The former was indeed not a Platonist, nor strictly speaking an Aristotelian, nor did he, like the modern Leibniz, waste those precious hours which might be employed in the invention of a fricassee, or facile gradu, the analysis of a sensation in frivolous attempts at reconciling the obstinate oils and waters of ethical discussion. Not at all. Bonbon was ionic. Bonbon was equally italic. He reasoned a priori. He also reasoned a posteriori. His ideas were innate, or otherwise. He believed in George of Trebizond. He believed in Bessarion. Bonbon was emphatically a bonbonist. I have spoken of the philosopher in his capacity of restaurateur. I would not, however, have any friend of mine imagine that, in fulfilling his hereditary duties in that line, our hero wanted a proper estimation of their dignity and importance. Far from it. It was impossible to say in which branch of his profession he took the greater pride. In his opinion, the powers of the intellect held intimate connection with the capabilities of the stomach. I am not sure, indeed, that he greatly disagreed with the Chinese, who held that the soul lies in the abdomen. The Greeks at all events were right, he thought, who employed the same words for the mind and the diaphragm. By this I do not mean to insinuate a charge of gluttony, or indeed any other serious charge to the prejudice of the metaphysician. If Pierre Bonbon had his failings, and what great man has not 1,000? If Pierre Bonbon, I say, had his failings, they were failings of very little importance, faults indeed which, in other tempers, have often been looked upon rather in the light of virtues. As regard of one of these foils, I should not have even mentioned it in this history but for the remarkable prominency, the extreme alto relievo, in which it jutted out from the plane of his general disposition. He could never let slip an opportunity of making a bargain. Not that he was avaricious. No, it was by no means necessary to the satisfaction of the philosopher that the bargain should be to his own proper advantage, provided a trade could be effected, a trade of any kind, upon any terms, or under any circumstances. A triumphant smile was seen for many days thereafter to enlighten his countenance, and a knowing wink of the eye to give evidence of his sagacity. At any epoch it would not be very wonderful if a humor so peculiar as the one I have just mentioned should elicit attention and remark. At the epoch of our narrative, had this peculiarity not attracted observation, there would have been room for wonder indeed. It was soon reported that, upon all occasions of the kind, the smile of Bon Bon was wont to differ widely from the downright grin with which he would laugh at his own jokes, or welcome an acquaintance. Hints were thrown out of an exciting nature. Stories were told of perilous bargains made in a hurry and repented of at leisure, and instances were adduced of unaccountable capacities, vague longings, and unnatural inclinations implanted by the author of all evil for wise purposes of his own. The philosopher had other weaknesses, but they are scarcely worthy our serious examination. For example, there are few men of extraordinary profundity who are found wanting in an inclination for the bottle. Whether this inclination be an exciting case, or rather a valid proof of such profundity, it is a nice thing to say. Bon Bon, as far as I can learn, did not think the subject adapted to minute investigation. Nor do I. Yet in the indulgence of a propensity so truly classical, it is not to be supposed that the restaurateur would lose sight of that intuitive discrimination, which was wont to characterize, at one and the same time, his essays and his omelettes. In his seclusions the vin de Bourgogne had its allotted hour, and there were appropriate moments for the Côte du Rhône. With him Saturn was to Medic what Catullus was to Homer. He would sport with a syllogism in sipping Saint Péray, but unravel an argument over Claude de Vougeot and an upset theory in a torrent of Chambertin. Well had it been if the same quick sense of propriety had attended him in the peddling propensity to which I have formerly alluded, but this was by no means the case. Indeed, to say the truth, that the trait of mind in the philosophic Bon Bon did begin at length to assume a character of strange intensity and mysticism, and appeared deeply tinctured with the diablerie of his favorite German studies. To enter the little café in the cul-de-sac Lefebvre was, at the period of our tale, to enter the sanctum of a man of genius. Bon Bon was a man of genius. There was not a sous cuisinier in Rouen who could not have told you that Bon Bon was a man of genius. His very cat knew it, and forbore to whisk her tail in the presence of the man of genius. His large water dog was acquainted with the fact, and upon the approach of his master, betrayed his sense of inferiority by a sanctity of deportment, a debasement of the ears, and a dropping of the lower jaw not altogether unworthy of a dog. It is, however, true that much of his habitual respect might have been attributed to the personal appearance of the metaphysician. A distinguished exterior will, I am constrained to say, have its way even with a beast, and I am willing to allow much in the outward man of the restaurateur calculated to impress the imagination of the quadruped. There is a peculiar majesty of the atmosphere of the little grate, if I may be permitted so equivocal an expression, where mere physical bulk alone will be found, at all times, inefficient in creating. If, however, Bon Bon was barely 3 feet in height, and if his head was diminutively small, still it was impossible to behold the rotundity of his stomach, without a sense of magnificence nearly bordering upon the sublime. In its size, both dogs and men must have seen a type of his acquirements, in its immensity of a fitting habitation for his immortal soul. I might here, if it so pleased me, dilate the matter of habiliment, and other mere circumstances of the external metaphysician. I might hint that the hair of our hero was worn short, combed smoothly over his forehead, and surmounted by a conical-shaped white flannel cap and tassels. That his pea-green jerkin was not after the fashion of those worn by the common class of restaurateurs at that day. That the sleeves were something fuller than the reigning costume permitted. That the cuffs were turned up, not as usual in the barbarous period, with cloth of the same quality and color as the garment, but faced with a more fanciful manner with the party-colored velvet of Genoa. That his slippers were of bright purple, curiously filigreed, and might have been manufactured in Japan, but for the exquisite pointing of the toes and the brilliant tints of the binding and embroidery. That his breeches were of the yellow satin-like material called amiable. That his sky-blue cloak, resembling in form of a dressing wrapper, and richly bestudded all over with crimson devices, floated cavalry upon his shoulders like a mist of the morning, and that his tout ensemble gave rise to the remarkable words of Benvenuta, the improvisatrix of Florence, that it was difficult to say whether Pierre Bonbon was indeed a bird of paradise, or rather a very paradise of perfection. I might say, expatiate upon all these points if I pleased, but I forbear. Merely personal details may be left to historical novelists. They are beneath the moral dignity of matter of fact. I have said, to enter the café in the cul-de-sac Lefebvre was to enter the sanctum of a man of genius. But then, it was only the man of genius who can duly estimate the merits of the sanctum. A sign, consisting of a vast folio, swung before the entrance. On one side of the volume was painted a bottle, on the reverse a pâté. On the back were visible in large letters, Œuvre de Bonbon. Thus was delicately shadowed forth the twofold occupation of the proprietor. Upon stepping over the threshold, the whole interior of the building presented itself to view. A long, low-pitched room of antique construction was indeed all the accommodation afforded by the café. In a corner of the apartment stood the bed of the metaphysician. An army of curtains, together with a canopy à la grecque, gave it an air at once classic and comfortable. In the corner diagonally opposite appeared, in direct family communion, the properties of the kitchen and the bibliothèque. A dish of polemics stood peacefully upon the dresser. Here lay an ovenful of the latest ethics. There a kettle of decimo melanges. Volumes of German morality were hand in glove with the gridiron. A toasting fork might be discovered by the side of Eusebius. Plato reclined at his ease in the frying pan, and contemporary manuscripts were filed away upon the spit. In other respects, the Café de Bonbon might be said to differ little from the usual restaurants of the period. A fireplace yawned opposite the door. On the right of the fireplace, an open cupboard displayed a formidable array of labeled bottles. It was here about 12 o'clock one night, during the severe winter, the comments of his neighbors upon his singular propensity, that Pierre Bonbon, I say, having turned them all out of his house, locked the door upon them with an oath, and betook himself in no very pacific mood to the comforts of a leathered-bottomed armchair, and a fire of blazing faggots. It was one of those terrific nights which are only met with once or twice during a century. It snowed fiercely, and the house tottered to its center with the floods of wind that, rushing through the crannies in the wall and pouring impetuously down the chimney, shook awfully the curtains of the philosopher's bed, and disorganized the economy of his patty-pans and papers. The huge folio sign that swung without, exposed to the fury of the tempest, creaked ominously, and gave out a moaning sound from its stanchions of solid oak. It was in no placid temper, I say, that the metaphysician drew up his chair to its customary station by the hearth. Many circumstances of a perplexing nature had occurred during the day to disturb the serenity of his meditations. In attempting des œufs à la princesse, he had unfortunately perpetrated an omelette à la reine. The discovery of a principle in ethics had been frustrated by the overturning of a stew. And last, not least, he had been thwarted in one of the most admirable bargains, which he at all times took such especial delight in bringing to a successful termination. But in the chafing of his mind at these unaccountable vicissitudes, there did not fail to be mingled some degree of that nervous anxiety, which the fury of a boisterous night is so well calculated to produce. Whistling to his more immediate vicinity, the large black-water dog we have spoken of before, and settling himself uneasily in his chair, he could not help casting a wary and unquiet eye towards the distant recesses of the apartment, whose inexorable shadows not even the red firelight itself could more than partially succeed in overcoming. Having completed a scrutiny whose exact purpose was perhaps unintelligible to himself, he drew close to his seat a small table, covered with books and papers, and soon became absorbed in the task of retouching a voluminous manuscript, intended for publication on the morrow. He had been thus occupied for some minutes when, "I am in no hurry, Monsieur Bonbon," suddenly whispered a whining voice in the apartment. "The devil!" ejaculated our hero, starting to his feet, overturning the table at his side, and staring around him in astonishment. "Very true," calmly replied the voice. "Very true? What is very true? How came you here?" vociferated the metaphysician, as his eye fell upon something which lay stretched at full length upon the bed. "I was saying," said the intruder without attending to the interrogatives, "I was saying that I am not at all pushed for time. that the business upon which I took the liberty of calling is of no pressing importance. In short, that I can very well wait until you have finished your exposition." "My exposition? There now! How do you know? How came you to understand that I was writing an exposition? Good God!" "Hush!" replied the figure in a shrill undertone, and arising quickly from the bed, he made a single step toward our hero, while an iron lamp that depended overhead swung convulsively back from his approach. The philosopher's amazement did not prevent a narrow scrutiny of the stranger's dress and appearance. The outlines of his figure, exceedingly lean, but much above the common height, were rendered minutely distinct by means of a faded suit of black cloth which fitted tight to the skin, but otherwise cut very much in the style of a century ago. These garments have evidently been intended for a much shorter person than their present owner. His ankles and wrists were left naked for several inches. In his shoes, however, a pair of very brilliant buckles gave the lie to the extreme poverty implied by the other portions of his dress. His head was bare and entirely bald, with the exception of a hinder part from which depended a queue of considerable length. A pair of green spectacles with side glasses protected his eyes from the influence of the light, and at the same time prevented our hero from ascertaining either their color or their conformation. About the entire person there was no evidence of a shirt, but a white cravat, of filthy appearance, was tied with extreme precision around the throat, and the ends hanging down formally side by side gave, although I dare say unintentionally, the idea of an ecclesiastic. Indeed, many other points, both in his appearance and demeanor, might have very well sustained a conception of the nature. Over his left ear he carried, after the fashion of a modern clerk, an instrument resembling the stylus of the ancients. In a breast pocket of his coat appeared conspicuously a small black volume fastened with clasps of steel. This book, whether accidentally or not, was so turned outwardly from the person as to discover the words Rituel Catholique in white letters upon the back. His entire physiognomy was interestingly saturnine, even cadaverously pale. The forehead was lofty and deeply furrowed with the ridges of contemplation. The corners of the mouth were drawn down into an expression of the most submissive humility. There was also a clasping of the hands as he stepped toward our hero, a deep sigh, and altogether a look of such utter sanctity as could not have failed to be unequivocally prepossessing. Every shadow of anger faded from the countenance of the metaphysician, as having completed a satisfactory survey of his visitor's person, he shook him cordially by the hand and conducted him to a seat. There would, however, be a radical error in attributing this instantaneous transition of feeling in the philosopher to any one of those causes which might naturally be supposed to have had an influence. Indeed, Pierre Bonbon, from what I have been able to understand of his disposition, was of all men the least likely to be imposed upon by any speciousness of exterior deportment. It was impossible that so accurate an observer of men and things should have failed to discover upon the moment the real character of the personage who had thus intruded upon his hospitality. To say no more, the conformation of his visitor's feet was sufficiently remarkable. He maintained lightly upon his head an inordinately tall hat. There was a tremulous swelling about the hinder part of his breeches, and the vibration of his coat-tail was a palpable fact. Judge, then, with what feelings of satisfaction our hero found himself thrown thus at once into the society of a person for whom he had at all times entertained the most unqualified respect. He was, however, too much of the diplomatist to let him escape any intimation of his suspicions in regard to the true state of affairs. It was not his cue to appear at all conscious of the high hour he thus unexpectedly enjoyed, but by leading his guest into the conversation to elicit some important ethical ideas, which might, in obtaining a place in his contemplated publication, enlighten the human race, and at the same time immortalize himself. Ideas which, I should have added, his visitor's great age and well-known proficiency in the science of morals might very well have enabled him to afford. Actuated by these enlightened views, our hero bade the gentleman sit down, while he himself took occasion to throw some faggots upon the fire, and place upon the now re-established table some bottles of Mousseau. Having quickly completed these operations, he drew his chair vis-à-vis to his companion's, and waited until the latter should open the conversation. But plans, even the most skillfully matured, are often thwarted in the onset of their application, and the restaurateur found himself nonplussed by the very first words of his visitor's speech. "I see you know me, Bonbon," said he. "Ha ha ha! He he he! Hi, hi, hi! Ho, ho, ho! Hoo, hoo, hoo! And the devil, dropping at once the sanctity of his demeanor, opened to its fullest extent a mouth from ear to ear, so as to display a set of jagged and fang-like teeth, and, throwing back his head, laughed long, loudly, wickedly, and uproariously, while the black dog, crouching down upon his haunches, joined lustily in the chorus, and the tabby cat, flying off the tangent, stood up on end, and shrieked in the farthest corner of the apartment. Not so the philosopher. He was too much a man of the world either to laugh like the dog, or by shrieks to betray the indecorous trepidation of the cat. It must be confessed he felt a little astonishment to see the white letters which formed the words Rituel Catholique on the book in his guest's pocket, momentarily changing both their color and their import, and in a few seconds, in place of the original title, the words Registre des condamnés blazed forth in characters of red. This startling circumstance, when Bon replied to his visitor's remark, imparted to his manner an air of embarrassment, which probably might, not otherwise, have been observed. "Why, sir," said the philosopher, "why, sir, to speak sincerely, I imagine I have some very faint idea of the remarkable honor." "Oh, yes, very well," interrupted his majesty. "Say no more. I see how it is." And hereupon, taking off his green spectacles, he wiped the glasses carefully with the sleeve of his coat, and deposited them in his pocket. If Bon had been astonished at the incident of the book, his amazement was now much increased by the spectacle which presented here itself to view. In raising his eyes with a strong feeling of curiosity to ascertain the color of his guest, he found them by no means black, as he had anticipated, nor gray, as might have been imagined, nor yet hazel nor blue, nor indeed yellow, nor red, nor purple, nor white, nor green, nor any other color in the heavens above, or in the earth beneath, or in the waters under the earth. In short, Pierre Bon not only saw plainly that his majesty had no eyes whatsoever, but could discover no indication of their having existed at any previous period, for the space where eyes should naturally have been was, I am constrained to say, simply a dead level of flesh. It was not in the nature of the metaphysician to forbear making some inquiry into the source of so strange a phenomenon, and the reply of his majesty was at once prompt, dignified, and satisfactory. "Eyes, my dear Bon, eyes, did you say? Oh, I perceive. The ridiculous prints, which are in circulation, have given you a false idea of my personal appearance? Eyes, true. Eyes, Pierre Bon, are very well in their proper place. That you would say is the head, right? The head of a worm. To you, likewise, these optics are indispensable. Yet I will convince you that my vision is more penetrating than your own. There is a cat I see, in the corner. A pretty cat. Look at her. Observe her well. Now, Bon, do you behold the thoughts? The thoughts, I say? The ideas? The reflections, which are being endangered in her pericranium? There it is now. You do not. She is thinking we admire the length of her tail and the profundity of her mind. She has concluded that I am the most distinguished of ecclesiastics, and that you are the most superficial of metaphysicians. Thus, you see, I am not altogether blind. But to one of my profession, the eyes you speak of would be merely an encumbrance, liable at any time to be put out by a toasting iron or a pitchfork. To you, I allow, these optical affairs are indispensable. Endeavor, Bon, to use them well. My vision is the soul." Hereupon the guest helped himself to the wine upon the table, and pouring out a bumper for Bon, requested him to drink it without scruple, and make himself perfectly at home. "A clever book, that of yours, Pierre," resumed his majesty, tapping our friend knowingly upon the shoulder, as the latter put down his glass after a thorough compliance with his visitor's injunction. "A clever book, that of yours, upon my honor. It's a work after my own heart. Your arrangement of the matter, I think, however, might be improved, and many of your notions remind me of Aristotle. That philosopher was one of my most intimate acquaintances. I liked him as much for his terrible ill temper as for his happy knack at making a blunder. There is only one solid truth in all that he has written, and for that I gave him the hint of our pure compassion for his absurdity. I suppose, Pierre Bon, you very well know to what divine moral truth I am alluding?" "Cannot say that I—" "Indeed! Why, it was I who told Aristotle that by sneezing, men expelled superfluous ideas through the proboscis. Which is undoubtedly the case, said the metaphysician, while he poured out for himself another bumper of Mousseau and offered his snuff-box to the fingers of his visitor. There was Plato, too, continued his Majesty, modestly declining the snuff-box and the compliment it implied. There was Plato, too, for whom at one time felt all the affection of a friend. You know Plato, Bon? Ah, no, I beg 1,000 pardons. He met me at Athens one day, at the Parthenon, and told me he was distressed for an idea. I bade him write down that, unos est in agios. He said that he would do so and went home, while I stepped over to the pyramids. But my conscience smote me for having uttered a truth, even to aid a friend. And hastening back to Athens, I arrived behind the philosopher's chair as he was inditing the agios. Giving the lambda a fill-up with my finger, I turned it upside down. Unus est in agios, and is, you perceive, the fundamental doctrines in his metaphysics. Were you ever at Rome? Asked the restaurateur as he finished his second bottle of Mousseau and drew from the closet a larger supply of Chambertin. But once, Monsieur Bonbon, but once. There was a time, said the devil, as if reciting some passage from a book. There was a time when occurred an anarchy of 5 years, during which the Republic, bereft of all of its officers, had no magistracy beside the tribunes of the people, and these were not legally vested with any degree of executive power. At that time, Monsieur Bonbon, at that time, only I was in Rome, and I have no earthly acquaintance, consequently, with any of its philosophy. What do you think of Epicurus? What do I think of whom? Said the devil in astonishment. You cannot surely mean to find any fault with Epicurus? What do I think of Epicurus? Do you mean me, sir? I am Epicurus. I am the same philosopher who wrote each of the 300 treatises commemorated by Diogenes Laertes. That's a lie, said the metaphysician, for the wine had gotten a little into his head. Very well, sir. Very well indeed, sir, said his Majesty, apparently much flattered. That's a lie, repeated the restaurateur dogmatically. That's a lie. Well, have it your own way, said the devil pacifically. And Bonbon, having beaten his Majesty at argument, thought it his duty to conclude a second bottle of Chambertin. As I was saying, resumed the visitor, as I was observing a little while ago, there are some very outre notions in that book of yours, Monsieur Bonbon. What, for instance, do you mean by all that humbug about the soul? Pray, sir, what is the soul? The soul, replied the metaphysician, referring to his manuscript, is undoubtedly... No, sir. Indubitably? No, sir. Indisputably? No, sir. Evidently? No, sir. Incontrovertibly? No, sir. No, sir. And beyond all question, no, sir. The soul is no such thing. Here the philosopher, looking daggers, took occasion to make an end, upon the spot, of his third bottle of Chambertin. Then, pray, sir, what is it? That is neither here nor there, Monsieur Bonbon, replied his Majesty musingly. I have tasted. That is to say, I have known some very bad souls and some pretty good ones. Here he smacked his lips, and, having unconsciously let fall his hand upon the volume in his pocket, was seized with a violent fit of sneezing. He continued. There was the soul of Cratinus, passable, Aristophanes, racy, Plato, exquisite. Not your Plato, but Plato, the comic poet. Your Plato would have turned the stomach of Cerberus. Pfui! And let me see. There were Nevius, and Andronicus, and Plautus, and Terentius. Then there were Lucilius, and Catullus, and Naso, and Quintus Flaccus. Dear Quinty, as I called him when he sung a succular for my amusement, while I toasted him, in pure good humor, on a fork. But they want flavor, these Romans. One fat Greek is worth a dozen of them, and besides will keep, which cannot be said of a Quirite. Let us taste your Saturn. Bonbon had by this time made up his mind to nil admirari, and endeavored to hand down the bottles in question. He was, however, conscious of a strange sound in the room like the wagging of a tail. Of this, although extremely indecent in his majesty, the philosopher took no notice, simply kicking the dog and requesting him to be quiet. The visitor continued. I found that Horace tasted very much like Aristotle. You know I'm fond of variety. Terentus I could not have told from Menander. Naso, to my astonishment, was Nicander in disguise. Virgilius had a strong twang of Theocritus. Martial put me much in mind of Archilochus. And Titus Livius was positively Polybius and none other. Here replied Bonbon, and his majesty proceeded. If I had a penchant, Monsieur Bonbon, if I had a penchant, it is for a philosopher. Let me tell you, sir, it is not every it is not every gentleman who knows how to choose a philosopher. Long ones are not good, and the best, if not carefully shelled, are apt to be a little rancid on account of the gall. Shelled? I mean taken out of the carcass. What do you think of a physician? Don't mention them! Here his majesty retched violently. I never tasted but one. That rascal Hippocrates smelt of asafoetida. Caught a wretched cold washing him in the Styx. And after all, he gave me the cholera morbus. The wretch! Ejaculated Bonbon. The absorption of the pill-box. And the philosopher dropped a tear. After all, continued the visitor, after all, if a gentleman wishes to live, he must have more talents than one or two, and with us a fat face is an evidence of diplomacy. How so? Why, we are sometimes exceedingly pushed for provisions. You must know that, in a climate so sultry as mine, it is frequently impossible to keep a spirit alive for more than 2 or 3 hours. And after death, unless picked immediately, and picked a spirit is not good, they will smell. You understand, eh? Putrefaction is always to be apprehended when the souls are consigned to us in the usual way. Good God! How do you manage? Here the iron lamp commenced swinging with redoubled violence, and the devil half started from his seat. However, with a silent sigh, he recovered his composure, merely saying to our hero in a low tone, I tell you what, Pierre Bonbon, we must have no more swearing. The host swallowed another bumper, by way of denoting thorough comprehension and acquiescence, and the visitor continued. Why, there are several ways of managing. The most of us starve. Some put up with the pickle. For my part, I purchase my spirits vivente corpore, in which case I find they keep very well. But the body. The body. The body. The body. Well, what of the body? Oh, I perceive. Why, sir, the body is not at all affected by the transaction. I have made innumerable purchases of the kind in my day, and the parties never experienced any inconvenience. There were Cain, and Nimrod, and Nero, and Caligula, and Dionysius, and Pisistratus, and 1,000 others, who never knew what it was to have a soul during the latter part of their lives. Yet, sir, these men adorn society. Why possession of his faculties, mental and corporeal? Who writes a keener epigram? Who reasons more wittily? But stay, I have his agreement in my pocketbook. Thus saying, he produced a red leather wallet, and took from it a number of papers. Upon some of these, Bonbon caught a glimpse of the letters Machiavelli, Mazza, Robespierre, with the words Caligula, George, Elizabeth. His Majesty selected a narrow slip of parchment, and from it read aloud the following words. In consideration of certain mental endowments, which it is unnecessary to specify, and in further consideration of 1,000 louis d'or, I, being aged 1 year and a month, do hereby make over to the bearer of this agreement all my right, title, and appurtenance in the shadow called my soul. Signed, A. Here his Majesty repeated a name, which I did not feel justified in indicating more unequivocally. A clever fellow that, resumed he. But like you, Monsieur Bonbon, he was mistaken about the soul a shadow. Truly, the soul a shadow. Ha ha ha! Hee hee hee! Hoo hoo hoo! Only think of a fricasseed shadow. Only think of a fricasseed shadow, exclaimed our hero, whose faculties were becoming much illuminated by the profundity of His Majesty's discourse. Only think of a fricasseed shadow? Now, damn! If I would have been such a nincompoop! My soul, Mr. Humph! Your soul, Monsieur Bonbon? Yes, sir. My soul is... What, sir? No shadow, damn! Do you mean to say... Yes, sir, my soul is... Humph! Yes, sir. Did you not intend to assert... My soul is... peculiarly qualified for... what, sir? Stew. Ha! Soufflé. Fricassee. Indeed. Ragout and fricandole. And see here, my good fellow, I'll let you have it. A bargain. Here the philosopher slapped His Majesty upon the back. Couldn't think of such a thing, said the latter calmly, at the same time rising from his seat. The metaphysician stared. Am supplied at present, said His Majesty. Said the philosopher. Have no funds on hand. What? Besides, very unhandsome in me, sir, to take advantage of your present disgusting and ungentlemanly situation. Here the visitor bowed and withdrew. In what manner cannot precisely be ascertained. But in a well-concerted effort to discharge a bottle at the villain, the slender chain was severed that depended from the ceiling, and the metaphysician prostrated by the downfall of the lamp. Philadelphia Saturday Courier, December 1st, 1832. The Assignation. Ill-fated and mysterious man, bewildered in the brilliancy of thine own imagination, and fallen in the flames of thine own youth, again in fancy I behold thee. Once more thy form hath risen before me, not, oh, not as thou art, in the cold valley and shadow, but as thou shouldst be, squandering away a life of magnificent meditation in that city of dim visions, thine own Venice, which is a star-beloved Elysium of the sea, and the wide windows of whose Palladian palaces look down with a deep and bitter meaning upon the secrets of her silent waters. Yes, I repeat it, as thou shouldst be. There are surely other worlds than this, other thoughts than the thoughts of the multitude, other speculations than the speculations of the sophist. Who then shall call thy conduct into question? Who blame thee for thy visionary hours? Or denounce those occupations as a wasting away of life, which were but the overflowings of thine everlasting energies? It was at Venice, beneath the covered archway there called the Pont di Sospiri, that I met for the third or fourth time the person of whom I speak. It is with a confused recollection that I bring to mind the circumstances of that meeting. Yet I remember. Ah, how should I forget the deep midnight, the bridge of sighs, the beauty of woman, and the genius of romance that stalked up and down the narrow canal. It was a night of unusual gloom. The great clock of the piazza had sounded the 5th hour of the Italian evening. The square of the Campanile lay silent and deserted, and the lights in the old ducal palace were dying fast away. I was returning home from the Piazzetta by way of the Grand Canal, but as my gondola arrived opposite the mouth of the canal San Marco, a female voice from its recesses broke suddenly upon the night in one wild, hysterical, and long-continued shriek. Startled at the sound, I sprang upon my feet, while the gondolier, letting slip his single oar, lost it in the pitchy darkness beyond a chance of recovery, and we were consequently left to the guidance of the current, which here sets from the greater into the smaller channel. Like some huge and sable-feathered condor, we were slowly drifting down towards the Bridge of Sighs, when 1,000 flambeaux flashing from the windows and down the staircases of the ducal palace turned all at once that deep gloom into a livid and preternatural day. A child, slipping from the arms of its own mother, had fallen from an upper window of the lofty structure into the deep and dim canal. The quiet waters had closed placidly over their victim, and although my own gondola was the only one in sight, many a stout swimmer, already in the stream, was seeking in vain upon the surface the treasure which was to be found, alas, only within the abyss. Upon the broad black marble flagstones at the entrance of the palace, and a few steps above the water, stood a figure which none who then saw can have ever since forgotten. It was the Marchesa Aphrodite, the adoration of all Venice, the gayest of the gay, the most lovely where all were beautiful, but still the young wife of the old and intriguing Mentoni, and the mother of that fair child, her first and only one, who now, deep beneath the murky water, was thinking in bitterness of heart upon her sweet caresses, and exhausting its little life in struggles to call upon her name. She stood alone. Her small, bare and silvery feet gleamed in the black mirror of marble beneath her. Her hair, not as more than half loosened for the night from its ballroom array, clustered amid a shower of diamonds round and round her classical head, in curls like those of the young hyacinth. A snowy white and gauze-like drapery seemed to be nearly the sole covering to her delicate form, but the midsummer and midnight air was hot, sullen, and still, and no motion in the statue-like form itself stirred even the folds of that raiment of very vapor which hung around it as the heavy marble hangs from the Niobe. Yet, strange to say, her large lustrous eyes were not turned downwards upon that grave wherein her brightest hope lay buried, but riveted in a widely different direction. The prison of the old Republic is, I think, the stateliest building in all Venice. But how could that lady gaze so fixedly upon it, when beneath her lay stifling her only child? Yon dark, gloomy niche, too, yawns right opposite her chamber window. What then could there be in its shadows, in its architecture, in its ivy-wreathed and solemn cornices, that the Marchesa di Mentoni had not wondered at 1,000 times before? Nonsense! Who does not remember that, at such a time as this, the eye, like a shattered mirror, multiplies the images of its sorrow, and sees in innumerable far-off places the woe which is close at hand? Many steps above the Marchesa, and within the arch of the Watergate, stood in full dress the satyr-like figure of Mentoni himself. He was occasionally occupied in thrumming a guitar, and seemed ennuyed to the very death, as at intervals he gave directions for the recovery of his child. Stupefied and aghast, I had myself no power to move from the upright position I had assumed upon first hearing the shriek, and must have presented to the eyes of the agitated group a spectral and ominous appearance, as with pale countenance and rigid limbs I floated down among them in that funereal gondola. All efforts proved in vain. Many of the most energetic in the search were relaxing their exertions and yielding to a gloomy sorrow. There seemed little hope for the child. How much less, then, for the mother? But now, from the interior of the dark niche which has been already mentioned as forming a part of the old Republican prison, and as fronting the lattice of the Marchesa, a figure muffled in a cloak stepped out within reach of the light, and pausing a moment upon the verge of the giddy descent, plunged headlong into the canal. As in an instant afterwards, he stood with the still living and breathing child within his grasp. Upon the marble flagstones by the side of the Marchesa, his cloak, heavy with the drenching water, became unfastened, and falling in folds about his feet, discovered to the wonder-stricken spectators the graceful person of a very young man, with the sound of whose name the greater part of Europe was then ringing. No word spoke the deliverer, but the Marchesa. She will now receive her child. She will press it to her heart. She will cling to its little form, and smother it with her caresses. Alas! Another's arms have taken it from the stranger. Another's arms have taken it away, and borne it afar off, unnoticed, into the palace. And the Marchesa, her beautiful lip trembles. Tears are gathering in her eyes, those eyes which, like Pliny's acanthus, are soft and almost liquid. Yes, tears are gathering in those eyes. And see, the entire woman thrills throughout the soul, and the statue has started into life. The pallor of the marble countenance, the swelling of the marble bosom, the very purity of the marble feet, we behold suddenly flushed over with a tide of ungovernable crimson, and a slight shudder quivers about her delicate frame, as a gentle air at Napoli about the rich silver lilies in the grass. Why should that lady blush? To this demand there is no answer, except that, having left in the eager haste and terror of a mother's heart the privacy of her own boudoir, she has neglected to enthrall her tiny feet in their slippers, and utterly forgotten to throw over her Venetian shoulders that drapery which is their due. What other possible reason could there have been for her so blushing, for the glance of those wild appealing eyes, for the unusual tumult of that throbbing bosom, for the convulsive pressure of that trembling hand? That hand which fell as Mentoni turned into the palace accidentally upon the hand of the stranger. What reason could there have been for the singularly low tone of those unmeaning words which the lady uttered hurriedly in bidding him adieu? "Thou hast conquered," she said, or the murmurs of the water deceived me. "Thou hast conquered. 1 hour after sunrise we shall meet, so let it be." The tumult had subsided, the lights had died away within the palace, and the stranger, whom I now recognized, stood alone upon the flags. He shook with inconceivable agitation, and his eye glanced around in search of a gondola. I could not do less than offer him the service of my own, and he accepted the civility. Having obtained an oar at the water-gate, we proceeded together to his residence while he rapidly recovered his self-possession, and spoke of our former slight acquaintance in terms of great apparent cordiality. There are some subjects upon which I take pleasure in being minute. The person of the stranger, let me call him by this title, who to all the world was still a stranger, the person of the stranger is one of these subjects. In height, he might have been below rather than above the medium size, although there were moments of intense passion when his frame actually expanded and belied the assertion. The light, almost slender symmetry of his figure promised more of that ready activity which he evinced at the Bridge of Sighs, than of that Herculean strength which he had been known to wield without an effort, upon occasions of more dangerous emergencies. With the mouth and chin of a deity, singular, wild, full, liquid eyes, whose shadows varied from pure hazel to intense and brilliant jet, and a profusion of curling black hair from which a forehead of unusual breadth gleamed forth at intervals, all light and ivory. His were features than which I have seen none more classically regular, except perhaps the marble ones of the Emperor Commodus. Yet his countenance was, nevertheless, one of those which all men have seen at some period of their lives, and have never afterwards seen again. It had no settled predominant expression to be fastened upon the memory, a countenance seen and instantly forgotten, but forgotten with a vague and never-ceasing desire of recalling it to mind. Not that the spirit of each rapid passion failed at any time to throw its own distinct image upon the mirror of that face, but that the mirror, mirror-like, retained no vestige of the passion when the passion had departed. Upon leaving him on the night of our adventure, he solicited me in what I thought an urgent manner, to call upon him very early the next morning. Shortly after sunrise, I found myself accordingly at his palazzo, one of those huge structures of gloomy yet fantastic pomp which tower above the waters of the Grand Canal in the vicinity of the Rialto. I was shown up a broad, winding staircase of mosaics, into an apartment whose unparalleled splendor burst through the opening door with an actual glare, making me blind and dizzy with luxuriousness. I knew my acquaintance to be wealthy. Report had spoken of his possessions in terms which I had even ventured to call terms of ridiculous exaggeration. But as I gazed about me, I could not bring myself to believe that the wealth of any subject in Europe could have supplied the princely magnificence which burned and blazed around. Although, as I say, the sun had arisen, yet the room was still brilliantly lighted up. I judged from this circumstance, as well as from an air of exhaustion in the countenance of my friend, that he had not retired to bed during the whole of the preceding night. In the architecture and embellishments of the chamber, the evident design had been to dazzle and astound. Little attention had been paid to the decor of what is technically called keeping, or to the properties of nationality. The eye wandered from object to object, and rested upon none. Neither the grotesques of the Greek painters, nor the sculptures of the best Italian days, nor the huge carvings of untutored Egypt. Rich draperies in every part of the room trembled to the vibration of low, melancholy music, whose origin was not to be discovered. The senses were oppressed by mingled and conflicting perfumes, reeking up from strange, convolute censers, together with a multitudinous flaring and flickering tongues of emerald and violet fire. The rays of the newly risen sun poured in upon the whole, through windows formed each of a single pane of crimson-tinted glass, glancing to and fro in 1,000 reflections from curtains which rolled from their cornices like cataracts of molten silver. The beams of natural glory mingled at length fitfully with the artificial light, and lay weltering in subdued masses upon a carpet of rich, liquid-looking cloth of chilly gold. "Ha ha 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 ha!" laughed the proprietor, motioning me to a seat as I entered the room, and throwing himself back at full length upon an ottoman. "I see," said he, perceiving that I could not immediately reconcile myself to the bienséance of so singular a welcome. "I see you're astonished at my apartment, at my statues, my pictures, my originality of conception in architecture and upholstery. Absolutely drunk, eh, with my magnificence? But pardon me, my dear sir." Here his tone of voice dropped to the very spirit of cordiality. Pardon me for my uncharitable laughter. You appeared so utterly astonished. Besides, some things are so completely ludicrous that a man must laugh or die. To die laughing must be the most glorious of all glorious deaths. Sir Thomas More, a very fine man was Sir Thomas More. Sir Thomas More died laughing, you remember? Also in the absurdities of Revisius Textor, there is a long list of characters who came to the same magnificent end. Do you know, however, continued he, musingly, that at Sparta, which is now called Pele Acore, at Sparta, I say, to the west of the citadel, among a chaos of scarcely visible ruins, is a kind of socle, upon which are still legible the letters A-A-E-M. They are undoubtedly part of P-E-A-A-E-M-A. Now at Sparta were 1,000 temples and shrines to 1,000 different divinities. How exceedingly strange that the altar of laughter should have survived all the others. But in the present instance, he resumed, with a singular alteration of voice and matter, I have no right to be merry at your expense. You might well have been amazed. Europe cannot produce anything so fine as this, my little regal cabinet. My other apartments are by no means of the same order, mere ultras of fashionable insipidity. This is better than fashion, is it not? Yet this has but to be seen to become the rage. That is, with those who could afford it at the cost of their own entire patrimony. I have guarded, however, against any such profanation, with one exception. You are the only human being, besides myself and my valet, who has been admitted within the mysteries of these imperial precincts since they have been bedizened, as you see. I bowed in acknowledgment, for the overpowering sense of splendor and perfume and music, together with the unexpected eccentricity of his address and manner, prevented me from expressing, in words, my appreciation of what I might have construed into a compliment. Here, he resumed, arising and leaning on my arm as he sauntered around the apartment. Here are paintings from the Greeks to Cimabue, and from Cimabue to the present hour. Many are chosen, as you see, with little deference to the opinions of virtue. They are all, however, fitting tapestry for a chamber such as this. Here, too, are some chefs d'oeuvre of the unknown great, and here unfinished designs by men celebrated in their day, whose very names the perspicacity of the academies have left to silence and to me. What think you? Said he, turning abruptly as he spoke. What think you of this Madonna della Pieta? It is Guido's own, I said, with all the enthusiasm of my nature, for I had been poring intently over its surpassing loveliness. It is Guido's own. How could you have obtained it? She is undoubtedly in painting what the Venus is in sculpture. Ha, said he thoughtfully, the Venus, the beautiful Venus, the Venus of the Medici, she of the diminutive head and the gilded hair. Part of the left arm, here his voice dropped so as to be heard with difficulty, and all the right are restoration. And in the coquetry of that right arm lies, I think, the quintessence of all affectation. Give me the Canova. The Apollo, too, is a copy. There can be no doubt of it. Blind fool that I am who cannot behold the boasted inspiration of the Apollo. I cannot help, pity me, I cannot help preferring the Antinous. Was it not Socrates who said that the statuary found his statue in the block of marble? Then Michelangelo was by no means original in his couplet. Non ha latimo artista alcun concetto, che un marmo solo ense non circumscript. It has been, or should be remarked, that in the manner of the true gentleman, we are always aware of a difference from the bearing of the vulgar, without being at once precisely able to determine in what such difference consists. Allowing the remark to have applied in its full force to the outward demeanor of my acquaintance, I felt it on that eventful morning still more fully applicable to his moral temperament and character. Nor could I better define that peculiarity of spirit which seemed to place him so essentially apart from all other human beings, than by calling it a habit of intense and continual thought, pervading even his most trivial actions, intruding upon his moments of dalliance, and interweaving himself with his very flashes of merriment, like adders which writhe from out the eyes of the grinning masks in the cornices around the temples of Persepolis. I could not help, however, repeatedly observing, through the mingled tone of levity and solemnity with which he rapidly descanted upon matters of little importance, a certain air of trepidation, a degree of nervous unction in action and in speech, an unquiet excitability of manner which appeared to me at all times unaccountable, and upon some occasions even filled me with alarm. Frequently, too, pausing in the middle of a sentence, whose commencement he had apparently forgotten, he seemed to be listening in the deepest attention, as if either in momentary expectation of a visitor, or to sounds which must have had existence in his imagination alone. It was during one of these reveries or pauses of apparent abstraction that, in turning over a page of the poet and scholar Politian's beautiful tragedy, the Orfeo, the first native Italian tragedy, which lay near me upon an ottoman, I discovered a passage underlined in pencil. It was a passage towards the end of the third act, a passage of the most heart-stirring excitement, a passage which, although tainted with impurity, no man shall read without a thrill of novel emotion, no woman without a sigh. The whole page was blotted with fresh tears, and upon the opposite interleaf were the following English lines, written in a hand so very different from the peculiar characters of my acquaintance that I had some difficulty in recognizing it as his own. Thou wast that all to me, love, for which my soul did pine, a green isle in the sea, love, a fountain and a shrine, all wreathed with fair sea of love, a fountain and a shrine. Ah, dream too bright to last. Ah, starry hope that didst arise, but to be overcast. A voice from out of the future cries onward, but o'er the past. Dim gulf, my spirit hover lies, sea of love, motionless, aghast. For alas, alas, with me the light of life is o'er. No more, no more, no more. Such language holds the solemn sea to the sands upon the shore. Shall bloom the sea of love, a fountain and a shrine. Now all my hours are trances, and all my nightly dreams are where the dark eye glances, and where thy footstep gleams, in what a sea of love dances by what Italian streams. Alas, for that accused time, they bore the oar, the billow, from love to tidal age and crime, and an unholy pillow, from me and from our misty clime, where weeps the silver willow. That these lines were written in English, a language with which I had not believed their author acquainted, afforded me little matter for surprise. I was too well aware of the extent of his acquirements, and of the singular pleasure he took in concealing them from observation, to be astonished at any similar discovery. But the place of date, I must confess, occasioned me no little amazement. It had been originally written London, and afterwards carefully overscored, not however so effectually as to conceal the word from a scrutinizing eye. I say this occasioned me no little amazement, for I well remember that in a former conversation with a friend, I particularly inquired if he had at any time met in London the Marchesa de Mentoni, who for some years previous to her marriage had resided in that city, when his answer, if I mistake not, gave me to understand that he had never visited the metropolis of Great Britain. I might as well here mention that I have more than once heard, without of course giving credit to a report involving so many improbabilities, that the person of whom I speak was not only by birth, but in education, an Englishman. There is one painting, said he, without being aware of my notice of the tragedy, there is still one painting which you have not seen. And throwing aside a drapery, he discovered a full-length portrait of the Marchesa Aphrodite. Human art could have done no more in the delineation of her superb beauty. The same ethereal figure, which stood before me the preceding night upon the steps of the ducal palace, stood before me once again. But in the expression of the countenance, which was beaming all over with smiles, there still lurked, incomprehensible anomaly, that fitful stain of melancholy, which will ever be found inseparable from the perfection of the beautiful. Her right arm lay folded over her bosom. With her left, she pointed downward to a curiously fashioned vase. One small fairy foot, alone visible, barely touched the earth, and scarcely discernible in the brilliant atmosphere which seemed to encircle and enshrine her loveliness, floated a pair of the most delicately imagined wings. My glance fell from the painting to the figure of my friend, and the vigorous words of Chapman's Bussy d'Amboise quivered instinctively upon my lips. He is up, there like a Roman statue. He will stand, till death have made him marble. Come, he said at length, turning towards a table of richly enameled and massive silver, upon which were a few goblets fantastically stained, together with two large Etruscan vases, fashioned in the same extraordinary model as that in the foreground of the portrait, and filled with what I suppose to be Johannisberger. Come, he said abruptly, let us drink. It is early, but let us drink. It is indeed early, he continued musingly as a cherub with a heavy golden hammer made the apartment ring with the first hour after sunrise. It is indeed early, but what matters it? Let us drink. Let us pour out an offering to yon solemn sun, which these gaudy lamps and censers are so eager to subdue. And having made me pledge him in a bumper, he swallowed in rapid succession several goblets of the wine. To dream, he continued, resuming the tone of his desultory conversation, as he held up to the rich light of a censer one of the magnificent vases. To dream has been the business of my life. I have therefore framed for myself, as you see, a bower of dreams. In the heart of Venice, could I have erected a better? You behold around you, it is true, a medley of architectural embellishments. The chastity of Ionia is offended by antediluvian devices, and the sphinxes of Egypt are outstretched upon carpets of gold. Yet the effect is incongruous to the timid alone. Proprieties of place, and especially of time, are the bugbears which terrify mankind from the contemplation of the magnificent. Once I was myself a decorist, but that sublimation of folly has palled upon my soul. All this is now the fitter for my purpose. Like these arabesque censers, my spirit is writhing in fire, and the delirium of this scene is fashioning me for the wilder visions of that land of real dreams whither I am now rapidly departing. He here paused abruptly, bent his head to his bosom, and seemed to listen to a sound which I could not hear. At length, erecting his frame, he looked upwards, and ejaculated the lines of the Bishop of Chichester. "Stay for me there, I will not fail, to meet thee in that hollow vale." In the next instant, confessing the power of the wine, he threw himself at full length upon an ottoman. A quick step was now heard upon the staircase, and a loud knock at the door rapidly succeeded. I was hasting to anticipate a second disturbance, when a page of Mentoni's household burst into the room, and faltered out in a voice choking with emotion the incoherent words, "My mistress! My mistress! Poisoned! Poisoned! Oh, beautiful! Oh, beautiful Aphrodite!" Bewildered, I flew to the ottoman, and endeavored to arouse the sleeper to a sense of the startling intelligence. But his limbs were rigid, his lips were livid, his lately beaming eyes were riveted upon I staggered back towards the table. My hand fell upon a cracked and blackened goblet, and a consciousness of the entire and terrible truth flashed suddenly over my soul. Godey's Lady Book, January 1834. Berenice. Misery is manifold. The wretchedness of earth is multiform. Overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow, its hues are as various as the hues of that arch, as distinct, too, yet as intimately blended. Overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow. How is it that from beauty I have derived a type of unloveliness? From the covenant of peace, a simile of sorrow. But, as in ethics, evil is a consequence of good, so in fact out of joy is sorrow born. Either the memory of past bliss is the anguish of today, or the agonies which are have their origin in the ecstasies which might have been. My baptismal name is Egeus. That of my family I will not mention. Yet there are no towers in the land more time-honored than my gloomy gray hereditary halls. Our line has been called a race of visionaries, and in many striking particulars, in the character of the family mansion, in the frescoes of the chief saloon, in the tapestries of the dormitories, in the chiseling of some buttresses in the armory, but more especially in the gallery of antique paintings, in the fashion of the library chamber, and, lastly, in the very peculiar nature of the library's contents, there is more than sufficient evidence to warrant the belief. The recollections of my earliest years are connected with that chamber, and with its volumes, of which latter I will say no more. Here died my mother. Herein I was born. But it is mere idleness to say that I had not lived before, that the soul has no previous existence. You deny it? Let us not argue the matter. Convinced myself, I seek not to convince. There is, however, a remembrance of aerial forms, of spiritual and meaning eyes, of sounds musical yet sad, a remembrance which will not be excluded. A memory like a shadow, vague, variable, indefinite, unsteady, and like a shadow, too, in the impossibility of my getting rid of it while the sunlight of my reason shall exist. In that chamber was I born, thus awakening from the long night of what seemed, but was not, nonentity, at once into the very regions of fairyland, into a palace of imagination, into the wild domains of monastic thought and erudition, It is not singular that I gazed around me with a startled and ardent eye, that I loitered away in my boyhood in books, and dissipated my youth in reverie, but it is singular that as years rolled away, and the noon of manhood found me still in the mansion of my fathers, it is wonderful what stagnation there fell upon the springs of my life. Wonderful how total an inversion took place in the character of my commonest thought. The realities of the world affected me as visions, and as visions only, while the wild ideas of the land of dreams became, in turn, not the material of my everyday existence, but in very deed that existence utterly and solely in itself. Berenice and I were cousins, and we grew up together in my paternal halls. Yet differently we grew, I ill of health and buried in gloom, she agile, graceful, and overflowing with energy. Hers the ramble on the hillside, mine the studies of the cloister. I living with my own heart and addicted, body and soul, to the most intense and painful meditation, she roaming carelessly through life, with no thought of the shadows in her path or the silent flight of the raven-winged hours. Berenice. I call upon her name, Berenice, and from the gray ruins of memory 1,000 tumultuous recollections are startled at the sound. Ah, vividly is her image before me now, as in the early days of her light-heartedness and joy. Oh, gorgeous yet fantastic beauty! Oh, Sylph amid the shrubberies of Arnheim! Oh, Naiad among its fountains! And then all is mystery and terror, and a tale which should not be told. Disease, a fatal disease, fell like the simoon upon her frame. Even while I gaze upon her, the spirit of change swept over her, pervading her mind, her habits, and her character, and in a manner of the most subtle and terrible, disturbing even the identity of her person. Alas, the destroyer came and went. And the victim, where is she? I knew her not, or knew her no longer as Berenice. Among the numerous train of maladies superinduced by that fatal and primary one which effected a revolution of so horrible a kind in the moral and physical being of my cousin, may be mentioned as the most distressing and obstinate in its nature, a species of epilepsy not unfrequently terminating in trance itself. Trance very nearly resembling positive disillusion, and from which her manner of recovery was in the most instances startling abrupt. In the meantime, my own disease, for I have been told that I should call it by no other appellation, my own disease grew rapidly upon me, and assumed finally a monomaniac character of a novel and extraordinary form, hourly and momently gaining vigor, and at length obtaining over me the most incomprehensible ascendancy. This monomania, if I must so term it, consists in a morbid irritability of those properties of the mind in metaphysical science termed the attentive. It is more than probable that I am not understood, but I fear indeed that it is in no manner possible to convey to the mind of the merely general reader an adequate idea of that nervous intensity of interest with which, in my case, the powers of meditation, not to speak technically, busied and buried themselves in the contemplation of even the most ordinary objects of the universe. To muse for long, unwearied hours, with my attention riveted to some frivolous device on the margin, or in the typography of a book, to become absorbed for the better part of a summer's day in a quaint shadow following aslant upon the tapestry or upon the floor, to lose myself for an entire night in watching the steady flame of a lamp, or the embers of a fire, to dream away whole days over the perfume of a flower, to repeat, monotonously, some common word until the sound, by dint of frequent repetition, ceased to convey any idea whatever to the mind, to lose all sense of motion or physical existence, by means of absolute bodily quiescence, long and obstinately persevered in. Such few of the most common and at least pernicious vagaries induced by a condition of the mental faculties, not indeed altogether unparalleled, but certainly bidding defiance to anything like analysis or explanation. Yet let me not be misapprehended. The undue earnest and morbid attention thus excited by objects in their own nature frivolous must not be confounded in character with that ruminating propensity common to all mankind, and more especially indulged in persons of ardent imagination. It was not even, as might be at first supposed, an extreme condition or exaggeration of such propensity, but primarily and essentially distinct and different. In the one instance, the dreamer, or enthusiast, being interested by an object usually not frivolous, imperceptibly loses sight of this object in a wilderness of deductions and suggestions issuing therefrom, until, at the conclusion of a daydream, often replete with luxury, he finds the insedamentum, or first cause of his musings, entirely vanished and forgotten. In my case, the primary object was invariably frivolous, although assuming through the medium of my distempered vision a refracted and unreal importance. Few deductions, if any, were made, and those few pertinaciously returning in upon the original object as a center. The meditations were never pleasurable, and at the termination of the reverie, the first cause, so far from being out of sight, had attained that supernaturally exaggerated interest which was the prevailing feature of the disease. In a word, the powers of mind more particularly exercised were with me, as I have said before, the attentive, and are, with the daydreamer, the speculative. My books at this epoch, if they do not actually serve to irritate the disorder, partook, it will be perceived, largely, in their imaginative and inconsequential nature of the characteristic qualities of the disorder itself. I well remember, among others, the treatise of the noble Italian Sciolius Secundus Curio, De Amplitudine Beatae Regni Dei, St. Austin's great work, The City of God, and Tertullian's De Carne Christi, in which the paradoxical sentence, Mortus est de filios, credibile est quia ineptum est, et sepultus resurrexit, certum est quia impossibile est, occupied my undivided time for many weeks of laborious and fruitless investigation. Thus it will appear that, shaken from its balance only by trivial things, my reason bore resemblance to that ocean crag spoken of by Ptolemy Hephaestion, which, steadily resisting the attacks of human violence, and the fiercer fury of the waters and the winds, trembled only to the touch of the flower called asphodel. And although, to a careless thinker, it might appear a matter beyond doubt that the alteration produced by her unhappy malady in the moral condition of Berenice would afford me many objects for the exercise of that intense and abnormal meditation, whose nature I have been at some trouble in explaining, yet such was not in any degree the case. In the lucid intervals of my infirmity, her calamity indeed gave me pain, and taking deeply to heart that total wreck of her fair and gentle life, I did not fall to ponder, frequently and bitterly, upon the wonder-working means by which so strange a revolution had been so suddenly brought to pass. But these reflections partook not of the idiosyncrasy of my disease, and were such as would have occurred under similar circumstances to the ordinary mass of mankind. True to its own character, my disorder revelled in the less important, but more startling changes wrought in the physical frame of Berenice, in the singular and most appalling distortion of her personal identity. During the brightest days of her unparalleled beauty, most surely I had never loved her. In the strange anomaly of my existence, feelings with me had never been of the heart, and my passions always were of the mind. Through the gray of the early morning, among the trellised shadows of the forest at noonday, and in the silence of my library at night, she had flitted by my eyes, and I had seen her, not as the living and breathing Berenice, but as the Berenice of a dream, not as a being of the earth, earthy, but as the abstraction of such a being, not as a thing to admire, but to analyze, not as an object of love, but as the theme of the most abstruse although desultory speculation. And now I shuddered in her presence, and grew pale at her approach, and yet, bitterly lamenting her fallen and desolate condition, I called to mind that she had loved me long, and in an evil moment I spoke to her of marriage. And at length the period of our nuptials was approaching, when, upon an afternoon in the winter of the year, one of those unseasonably warm, calm, and misty days which are the nurse of the beautiful Halcyon, I sat, as I thought alone, in the inner apartment of the library, but uplifting my eyes I saw that Berenice stood before me. Was it my own excited imagination, or the misty influence of the atmosphere, or the uncertain twilight of the chamber, or the grey draperies which fell around her figure, that caused in it so vacillating and indistinct an outline? I could not tell. She spoke no word, and I, not for worlds, could I have uttered a syllable. An icy chill ran through my frame. A sense of insufferable anxiety oppressed me. A consuming curiosity pervaded my soul, and, sinking back upon the chair, I remained for some time breathless and motionless, with my eyes riveted upon her person. Alas, its emaciation was excessive, and not one vestige of the former being lurked in any single line of the contour. My burning glances at length fell upon the face. The forehead was high and very pale, and singularly placid, and the once jetty hair fell partially over it, and overshadowed the hollow temples with innumerable ringlets, now a vivid yellow, and jarring discordantly in their fantastic character with the reigning melancholy of the countenance. The eyes were lifeless and lustreless, and seemingly pupilless, and I shrank involuntarily from their glassy stare to the contemplation of the thin and shrunken lips. They parted, and in a smile of peculiar meaning, the teeth of the changed Berenice disclosed themselves slowly to my view. Would to God that I had never beheld them, or that, having done so, I had died! The shutting of a door disturbed me, and looking up, I found that my cousin had departed from the chamber. But from the disordered chamber of my brain had not, alas, departed, and would not be driven away, the white and ghastly spectrum of the teeth. Not a speck on their surface, not a shade on their enamel, not an indenture in their edges. But what that period of her smile had sufficed to brand in upon my memory. I saw them now even more unequivocally than I beheld them then. The teeth! The teeth! They were here, and there, and everywhere, and visible and palpably before me. Long, narrow, and excessively white, with the pale lips writhing about them, as in the very moment of their first terrible development. Then came the full fury of my monomania, and I struggled in vain against its strange and irresistible influence. In the multiplied objects of the external world, I had no thoughts but for the teeth. For these I had longed with a frenzied desire. All other matters and all different interests became absorbed in their single contemplation. They alone were present to the mental eye, and they, in their sole individuality, became the essence of my mental life. I held them in every light. I turned them in every attitude. I surveyed their characteristics. I dwelt upon their peculiarities. I pondered upon their conformation. I mused upon the alteration in their nature. I shuddered as I assigned to them in imagination a sensitive and sentient power, and even unassisted by the lips, a capability of moral expression. Of Mademoiselle Saul it has well been said, "Qui tout c'est pas étant des sentiments," and of Berenice I more seriously believed, "Que tout c'est étant des idées." Des idées! Ah, here was the idiotic thought that destroyed me. Dis-eat-day. Ah, therefore it was that I coveted them so madly. I felt that their possession could alone ever restore me to peace, in giving me back to reason. And the evening closed in upon me thus. And then the darkness came and tarried and went. And the day again dawned. And the mists of a second night were now gathering around. And still I sat motionless in the solitary room. And still I sat buried in meditation. And still the phantasma of the teeth maintained its terrible ascendancy, as with the most vivid, hideous distinctness it floated about amid the changing lights and shadows of the chamber. At length there broke in upon my dreams a cry of horror and dismay, and thereunto, after a pause, succeeded the sounds of troubled voices, intermingled with many low moanings of sorrow and pain. I arose from my seat, and, throwing open one of the doors of the library, saw standing out in the antechamber a servant maiden, all in tears, who told me that Berenice was no more. She had been seized with epilepsy in the early morning, and now, at the closing in of the night, the grave was ready for its tenant, and all the preparations for the burial were completed. I found myself sitting in the library, and again sitting there alone. It seemed that I had newly awakened from a confused and exciting dream. I knew that it was now midnight, and I was well aware that since the setting of the sun, Berenice had been interred. But of that dreary period which intervened I had no positive, at least no definite comprehension. Yet its memory was replete with horror. Horror more horrible from being vague, and terror more terrible from ambiguity. It was a fearful page in the record of my existence, written all over with dim and hideous and unintelligible recollections. I strived to decipher them, but in vain. While ever and anon, like the spirit of a departed sound, the shrill and piercing shriek of a female voice seemed to be ringing in my ears. I had done a deed. What was it? I asked myself the question aloud, and the whisper echoes of the chamber answered me. What was it? On the table beside me burned a lamp, and near it lay a little box. It was of no remarkable character, and I had seen it frequently before, for it was the property of the family physician. But how it came there upon my table, and why did I shudder in regarding it? These things were in no manner to be accounted for, and my eyes at length dropped to the open pages of a book, and to a sentence underscored therein. The words were the singular but simple ones of the poet Ebn Zayat. Dicebant mihi sadoles, si sepulchrum amice visitatem, curas meas aliquantulum fore levatus. Why then, as I perused them, did the hairs of my head erect themselves on end, and the blood of my body become congealed with my veins? There came a light tap at the library door, and, pale as a tenant of a tomb, a menial entered upon tiptoe. His looks were wild with terror, and he spoke to me in a voice tremulous, husky, and very low. What said he? Some broken sentences I heard. He told of a wild cry disturbing the silence of the night, of the gathering together of the household, of a search in the direction of the sound, and then his tones grew thrillingly distinct as he whispered me of a violated grave, of a disfigured body enshrouded, yet still breathing, still palpitating, still alive. He pointed to garments. They were muddy and clotted with gore. I spoke not, and he took me gently by the hand. It was intended with the impress of human nails. He directed my attention to some object against the wall. I looked at it for a few minutes. It was a spade. With a shriek, I bounded to the table and grasped the box that lay upon it. But I could not force it open, and in my tremor it slipped from my hands and fell heavily and burst into pieces. And from it, with a rattling sound, there rolled out some instruments of dental surgery, intermingled with 32 small white and ivory-looking substances that were scattered to and fro about the floor. Southern Literary Messenger, March 1835. Morella. With a feeling of deep yet most singular affection, I regarded my friend Morella. Thrown by accident into her society many years ago, my soul, from our first meeting, burned with fires it had never before known. But the fires were not of Eros, and bitter and tormenting to my spirit was the gradual conviction that I could in no manner define their unusual meaning or regulate their vague intensity. Yet we met, and fate bound us together at the altar, and never spoke of passion nor thought of love. She, however, shunned society, and attaching herself to me alone rendered me happy. It is a happiness to wonder. It is a happiness to dream. Morella's erudition was profound. As I hope to live, her talents were of no common order. Her powers of mind were gigantic. I felt this, and in many matters became her pupil. I soon, however, found that, perhaps on account of her Pressburg education, she placed before me a number of those mystical writings which are usually considered the mere dross of the early German literature. These, for what reason I could not imagine, were her favorite and constant study. And that, in process of time they became my own, should be attributed for the simple but effectual influence of habit and example. In all this, if I err not, my reason had little to do. My convictions, or I forget myself, were in no manner acted upon by the ideal, nor was any tincture of the mysticism which I read to be discovered, unless I am greatly mistaken either in my deeds or in my thoughts. Persuaded by this, I abandoned myself implicitly to the guidance of my wife, and enter with an unflinching heart into the intricacies of her studies. And then, when poring over forbidden pages, I felt a forbidden spirit enkindling within me. Would Morella place her cold hand upon my own, and rake up from the ashes of a dead philosophy some low, singular words, whose strange meaning burned themselves in upon my memory. And then, hour after hour, would I linger by her side, and dwell upon the music of her voice, until at length its melody was tainted with terror, and there fell a shadow upon my soul, and I grew pale, and shuddered inwardly at those two unearthly tones. And thus joy suddenly faded into horror, and the most beautiful became the most hideous, as Hinnon became Gehenna. It is unnecessary to state the exact character of those disquisitions which, growing out of the volumes I have mentioned, formed for so long a time almost the sole conversation of Morella and myself. By the learned, in what might be termed theological morality, they will be readily conceived, and by the unlearned they would at all events be little understood. The wild pantheism of Fichte, the modified Pelagonidia of the Pythagoreans, and above all, the doctrines of identity, as urged by Schelling, were generally the points of discussion presenting the most of beauty to the imaginative Morella. That identity which is termed personal, Mr. Locke, I think, truly defines to consist in the saneness of rational being, and since by person we understand an intelligent essence having reason, and since there is a consciousness which always accompanies thinking, it is this which makes us all that to be which we call ourselves, thereby distinguishing us from other beings that think, and giving us our personal identity. But the principium individuationis, the notion of that identity which at death is, or is not, lost forever, was to me at all times a consideration of intense interest, not more from the perplexing and excited nature of its consequences, than from the marked and agitated manner in which Morella mentioned them. But indeed, the time had now arrived when the mystery of my wife's manner oppressed me as a spell. I could no longer bear the touch of her wan fingers, nor the low tone of her musical language, nor the luster of her melancholy eyes. And she knew all this, but did not upbraid. She seemed conscious of my weakness or my folly, and, smiling, called it fate. She seemed also conscious of a cause to me unknown for the gradual alienation of my regard, but she gave me no hint or token of its nature. Yet was she woman, and pined away daily. In time, the crimson spot settled steadily upon the cheek, and the blue veins upon the pale forehead became prominent. And one instant my nature melted into pity, but in next I met the glance of her meaning eyes, and then my soul sickened and became giddy with the giddiness of one who gazes downward into some dreary and unfathomable abyss. Shall I then say that I longed with an earnest and consuming desire for the moment of Morella's decease? I did, but the fragile spirit clung to its tenement of clay for many days, for many weeks and irksome months, until my tortured nerves obtained the mastery over my mind, and I grew furious through delay, and with a heart of a fiend, cursed the days and hours and the bitter moments, which seemed to lengthen and lengthen as her gentle life declined, like shadows in the dying of the day. But one autumnal evening, when the winds lay still in heaven, Morella called me to her bedside. There was a dim mist over all the earth, and a warm glow upon the waters, and amid the rich October leaves of the forest, a rainbow from the firmament had surely fallen. "It is a day of days," she said as I approached, "a day of all days, either to live or die. It is a fair day for the sons of earth and life. Ah, more fair for the daughters of heaven and death." I kissed her forehead, and she continued, "I am dying, yet shall I live." "Morella!" "The days have never been when thou couldst love me, but her whom in life thou didst abhor, in death thou shalt adore." "Morella!" "I repeat, I am dying, but within me is a pledge of that affection, ah, how little, which thou didst feel for me, Morella. And when my spirit departs shall the child live, thy child and mine, Morella's. But thy days shall be days of sorrow, that sorrow which is the most lasting of impressions, as the cypress is the most enduring of trees. For the hours of thy happiness are over, and joy is not gathered twice in a life, as the roses of Paestum twice in a year. Thou shalt no longer then play the Teian with time, but being ignorant of the myrtle and the vine, thou shalt bear about with thee thy shroud on the earth, as do the Mussulmen at Mecca." "Morella!" I cried. "Morella, how knowst thou this?" But she turned away her face upon the pillow, and a slight tremor coming over her limbs, she thus died, and I heard her voice no more. Yet, as she had foretold, her child, to which in dying she had given birth, which breathed not until the mother breathed no more, her child, a daughter, lived, and she grew strangely in stature and intellect, and was the perfect resemblance of her who had departed, and I loved her, with a love more fervent than I had believed it possible to feel for any denizen of earth. But ere long the heaven of this pure affection became darkened, and gloom, and horror, and grief swept over it in clouds. I said the child grew strangely in stature and intelligence. Strange indeed was her rapid increase in bodily size, but terrible, oh, terrible were the tumultuous thoughts which crowded upon me while watching the development of her mental being. Could it be otherwise when I daily discovered in the conceptions of the child the adult powers and faculties of the woman, when the lessons of experience fell from the lips of infancy, and when the wisdom or the passions of maturity I found hourly gleaming from its full and speculative eye? When I say all this became evident to my appalled senses, when I could no longer hide it from my soul, nor throw it off from those perceptions which trembled to receive it, is it to be wondered at that suspicious, of a nature fearful and exciting, crept in upon my spirit, or that my thoughts fell back aghast upon the wild tales and thrilling theories of the entombed Morella? I snatched from the scrutiny of the world a being whom destiny compelled me to adore, and in the rigorous seclusion of my home watched with an agonizing anxiety over all which concerned the beloved. And as years rolled away, and I gazed day after day upon her holy and mild and eloquent face, and pored over her maturing form, day after day did I discover new points to resemblance in the child to her mother, the melancholy and the dead, and hourly grew darker these shadows of similitude, and more full, and more definite, and more perplexing, and more hideously terrible in their aspect. For that her smile was like her mother's I could bear, but then I shuddered at its too perfect identity. That her eyes were like Morella's I could endure, but then they too often looked down into the depths of my soul with Morella's own intense and bewildered meaning. And in the contour of the high forehead, and in the ringlets of the silken hair, and in the wan fingers which buried themselves therein, and in the sad musical tones of her speech, and above all, oh, above all, in the phrases and expressions of the dead on the lips of the loved and the living, I found food for consuming thought and horror, for a worm that would not die. Thus passed away 2 lustra of her life, and as yet my daughter remained nameless upon the earth. My child and my love were the designations usually prompted by a father's affection, and the rigid seclusion of her days precluded all other intercourse. Morella's name died with her at her death. Of the mother, I had never spoken to the daughter. It was impossible to speak. Indeed, during the brief period of her existence, the latter had received no impressions from the outward world, save such as might have been afforded by the narrow limits of her privacy. But at length the ceremony of baptism presented to my mind, in its unnerved and agitated condition, a present deliverance from the terrors of my destiny, and at the baptismal font I hesitated for a name. And many titles of the wise and beautiful of old and modern times, of my own and foreign lands, came thronging to my lips, with many, many fair titles of the gentle, and the happy, and the good. What prompted me, then, to disturb the memory of the buried dead? What demon urged me to breathe that sound, which in its very recollection was wont to make ebb the purple blood in torrents from the temples to the heart? What fiend spoke from the recesses of my soul when amid those dim aisles, and in the silence of the night, I whispered within the ears of the holy men the syllables, Morella? What more than fiend convulsed the features of my child, and overspread them with hues of death, as starting at the scarcely audible sound, she turned her glassy eyes from the earth to heaven, and falling prostrate on the black slabs of our ancestral vault, responded, I am here. Distinct, coldly, calmly distinct, fell those few simple sounds within my ear, and thence, like molten lead, rolled hissingly into my brain. Years may pass away, but the memory of that epoch never. Nor was I indeed ignorant of the flowers and the vine, but the hemlock and the cypress overshadowed me night and day. And I kept no reckoning of time or place, and the stars of my fate faded from heaven, and therefore the earth grew dark, and its figures passed by me like flitting shadows, and among them all I beheld only Morella. The winds of the firmament breathed but one sound within my ears, and the ripples upon the sea murmured evermore, Morella. But she died, and with my own hands I bore her to the tomb, and I laughed with a long and bitter laugh, as I found no traces of the first in the channel where I laid the second. Morella. Southern Literary Messenger, April, 1835. Lionizing. I am, that is to say, I was, a great man, but I am neither the author of Junius nor the man in the mask. For my name, I believe, is Robert Jones, and I was born somewhere in the city of Fumfudge. The first action of my life was the taking hold of my nose with both hands. My mother saw this, and called me a genius. My father wept for joy, and presented me with a treatise on nosology. This I mastered before I was breeched. I now began to feel my way in the science, and soon came to understand that, provided a man had a nose sufficiently conspicuous, he might, by merely following it, arrive at a lionship. But my attention was not confined to theories alone. Every morning I gave my proboscis a couple of pulls, and swallow half-dozen of drams. When I came of age, my father asked me one day if I would step with him into his study. "My son," said he when we were seated, "what is the chief end of your existence?" "My father," I answered, "it is the study of nosology." "And what, Robert," he inquired, "is nosology?" "Sir," I said, "it is the science of noses." "And can you tell me," he demanded, "what is the meaning of a nose?" "A nose, my father," I replied, greatly softened, "has been variously defined by about 1,000 different authors." Here I pulled out my watch. "It is now noon or thereabouts. We shall have time enough to get through with all of them before midnight. To commence, then. The nose, according to Bartholinus, is that protuberance, that bump, that excrescence, that—" "Will do, Robert," interrupted the good old gentleman. "I am thunderstruck at the extent of your information. I am positively, upon my soul." Here he closed his eyes and placed his hand upon his heart. "Come here." Here he took me by the arm. "Your education may now be considered as finished. It is high time you should scuffle for yourself, and you cannot do a better thing than merely follow your nose. So. Here he kicked me downstairs and out of the door. So get out of my house, and God bless you. As I felt within me the divine afflatus, I considered this accident rather fortunate than otherwise. I resolved to be guided by the paternal advice. I determined to follow my nose. I gave it a pull or two upon the spot, and wrote a pamphlet on nosology forthwith. All Fumfudge was in an uproar. "Wonderful genius," said the Quarterly. "Superb physiologist," said the Westminster. "Clever fellow," said the Foreign. "Fine writer," said the Edinburgh. "Profound thinker," said the Dublin. "Great man," said Bentley. "Divine soul," said Fraser. "One of us," said Blackwood. "Who can he be?" said Miss Bablu. "What can he be?" said Big Miss Bablu. "Where can he be?" said Little Miss Bablu. But I paid these people no attention whatever. I just stepped into the shop of an artist. The Duchess of Bless My Soul was sitting for her portrait. The Marquis of So-and-so was holding the Duchess's poodle. The Earl of This and That was flirting with her salts, and His Royal Highness of Touch-Me-Not was leaning upon the back of her chair. I approached the artist, and turned up my nose. "Oh, beautiful!" sighed her Grace. "Oh, my!" lisped the Marquis. "Oh, shocking!" groaned the Earl. "Oh, abominable!" growled His Royal Highness. "What will you take for it?" asked the artist. "For his nose!" shouted her Grace. £1,000, said I, sitting down. £1,000? inquired the artist musingly. £1,000, said I. Beautiful, said he, entranced. £1,000, said I. Do you warrant it? He asked, turning the nose to the light. I do, said I, blowing it well. Is it quite original? He inquired, touching it with reverence. Humph, said I, twisting it to one side. Has no copy been taken? He demanded, surveying it through a microscope. None, said I, turning it up. Admirable, he ejaculated, throwing quite off his guard by the beauty of the maneuver. £1,000, said I. £1,000? said he. Precisely, said I. £1,000? said he. Just so, said I. You shall have them, said he. What a piece of virtue! So he drew me a cheque upon the spot, and took a sketch of my nose. I engaged rooms in Jermyn Street, and sent Her Majesty the 99th edition of the Nosology, with a portrait of the proboscis. That sad little rake, the Prince of Wales, invited me to dinner. We were all lions and rochers. There was a modern Platonist. He quoted Porphyry, Iamblichus, Plotinus, Porcellus, Heracles, Maximus Tyrius, and Syrianus. There was a human perfectibility man. He quoted Turgot, Price, Priestley, Condorcet, de Stael, and the ambitious student in ill health. There was Sir Positive Paradox. He observed that all fools were philosophers, and that all philosophers were fools. There was Aestheticus Ethics. He spoke of fire, unity, and atoms, bipart and pre-existent soul, affinity, and discord, primitive intelligence, and homomeria. There was Theologus Theology. He talked of Eusebius and Irenaeus, heresy and the Council of Nice, Puseyism and consubstantialism, homousios and homoiousios. There was fricassee from the Rocher de Cancale. He mentioned moureton of red tongue, cauliflower with velouté sauce, veal à la Sainte menu, marinade à la Sainte Florentin, and orange gelies and Marseille. There was Bibulus au Bumper. He touched upon Latour and Machbrunnen, upon Masseur and Chambertin, upon Richebourg and St. George, upon Haut-Brion, Leonville, and Medoc, upon Baroque and Prignac, upon Grave, upon Saturne, upon Lafitte, and upon Saint-Paré. He shook his head at Claude de Vougeot, and told with his eyes shut the difference between Sherry and Amontillado. There was Signor Tintantantino from Florence. He discoursed Ciambui, Arpino, Carpaccio, and Argostino, of the gloom of Caravaggio, of the amenity of Albano, of the colors of Titan, of the frowns of Rubens, and of the waggeries of John Steen. There was the president of the Fun Fudge University. He was of opinion that the moon was called Bendis in Thrace, Bubastis in Egypt, Diane in Rome, and Artemis in Greece. There was a Grand Turk from Stamboul. He could not help thinking that the angels were horses, cocks, and bulls, that somebody in the sixth heaven had 70,000 heads, and that the earth was supported by a blue sky cow with an incalculable number of green horns. There was Delphinus Polyglot. He told us what had become of the 83 lost tragedies of Aeschylus, of the 54 orations of Isaias, of the 391 speeches of Lysias, of the 180 treatises of Theophrastus, of the 8th book of the conic sections of Apollonius, of Pindar's hymns and dithyrambics, and of the 45 tragedies of Homer Jr. There was Ferdinand Fitzfossilis Feldspar. He informed us all about internal fires and tertiary formation, about aeriforms, fluidiforms, and solidiforms, about quartz and marl, about schist and scarl, about gypsum and trap, about talc and calc, about blende and hornblende, about mica slate and pudding stone, about syenite and lepidolite, about hematite and tremolite, about antimony and chalcedony, about manganese and whatever you please. There was myself. I spoke of myself, of myself, of myself, of myself, of nosology, of my pamphlet, and of myself. I turned up my nose, and I spoke of myself. "Marvelous clever man," said the prince. "Superb," said his guests, and next morning her grace of Bless My Soul paid me a visit. "Will you go to Almack's, pretty creature?" she said, tapping me under the chin. "Upon honor," said I. "Nose and all?" she asked. "As I live," I replied. "Here then is a card, my life. Shall I say you will be there?" "Dear Duchess, with all my heart." "Pshaw, no. But with all your nose?" "Every bit of it, my love," said I, so I gave it a twist or two, and found myself at Almack's. The rooms were crowded to suffocation. "He is coming," said somebody on the staircase. "He is coming," said somebody farther up. "He is coming," said somebody farther still. "He is come," exclaimed the Duchess. "He is come, the little love." And seizing me firmly by both hands, she kissed me thrice upon the nose. A marked sensation immediately ensued. "Dio volo!" cried Count Carpiconuti. "Dios guarda!" muttered Don Stiletto. "Mille tonnerre!" ejaculated the Prince de Grenouille. "Tausend Teufel!" growled the Elector of Blundenuff. It was not to be borne. I grew angry. I turned short upon Blundenuff. "Sir," said I to him, "you are a baboon." "Sir," he replied after a pause, "Donner und Blitzen." This was all that could be desired. We exchanged cards. At Chalk Farm, the next morning, I shot off his nose, and then called upon my friends. "Bete," said the first. "Fool," said the second. "Dolt," said the third. "Ass," said the fourth. "Ninny," said the fifth. "Noodle," said the sixth. "Be off," said the seventh. At all this I felt mortified, and so called upon my father. "Father," I asked, "what is the chief end of my existence?" "My son," he replied, "it is still the study of nosology, but in hitting the elector upon the nose you have overshot your mark. You have a fine nose, it is true, but then Blundenuff has none. You are damned, and he has become the hero of the day. I grant you that in Fumfudge the greatness of a lion is in proportion to the size of his proboscis. But, good heavens, there is no competing with a lion who has no proboscis at all." Southern Literary Messenger, May 1835.